Hello and welcome to the Weekly Stuff Podcast with Jonathan Lack.
And Sean Chapman.
We are here to talk about stuff.
Yes, again.
Again, for you guys it's been a week. For us it's been 2 minutes.
Yeah, but man, what a 2 minutes. What a 2 minutes.
I think we figured out the meaning of life in those 2 minutes, Sean.
I certainly did. Yeah.
Absolutely. So this week we are here to do our long-promised, long-awaited Uncharted Retrospective episode.
Yes.
The Uncharted Trilogy by Naughty Dog, originally for the PlayStation 3. That was their big franchise for that generation. And been a while since the last one came out, but in a few weeks here, Uncharted 4, A Thief's End, after truly countless delays, will finally be coming to our consoles, to PS4. And is it safe to say we couldn't be more excited?
Yeah, it's the first big AAA game coming out this year that is really getting me interested. You know, it feels like it's been a while.
I mean, just the mere fact that it's the first Naughty Dog game for the PS4, or original game for the PS4, is reason enough to celebrate, because I think this is going to be a theme. If you look at what they did with the fucking PS3, what can they do with something 10 times as powerful?
Well, we'll find out soon enough, Jonathan.
We're going to find out soon enough. So we're going to go through
the answer to that is you get a grappling hook. I played the beta. It's pretty cool.
Awesome. So we are going to go through the Uncharted series, talk about that today. That's going to be this entire episode. There will be spoilers for the trilogy, although I would contend you really can't spoil these games.
Yeah, because it's not big on twists and stuff like that.
No major character dies dramatically or anything.
Spoilers, Jonathan. Oh my god. You can't tell us things that don't happen in something.
That's the worst thing about spoiler culture, is people getting mad about that kind of shit. Anyway.
But seriously, you can't.
Yeah, Tyrion's still alive on Game of Thrones because he's the star. That's not a fucking spoiler, you idiots.
Oh, no.
And Jon Snow's coming back, too.
I haven't even seen that show, Jonathan. Why are you telling me things that happened in a show that I don't know or particularly care about? You spoiled it all.
All right, so if anything interesting has happened in the world since last week, we're not talking about it this week because we recorded this 2 weeks ago.
Yeah.
Our previous episode, number 141, we just did a lot of random ramblings and stuff, and you can get your fix there, and then we'll be back next week to catch up on everything.
Yeah.
You're going to tell us what New York was like.
Yes, I will, if I survive.
Yeah, I want to hear how Wicked was.
I mean, as we talked about last podcast, for more or less the whole podcast, how much I love musicals. I just go to see every musical that exists as many times as I can. I like to see all the different productions of my favorite musicals and compare them with me and all my musical friends. It's a lifetime passion, really.
You got tickets to Hamilton, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I also, people don't know, but I was the one who wrote the Spider-Man musical as well. That was me. That was my work. I'm very proud of it.
If they just made a movie of the Spider-Man musical, do you think that would be better or worse than Amazing Spider-Man 2?
Better. At least there's probably at least one good song in that musical. I don't know, but there has to be one okay song. That would be enough to put it over the edge, I think.
It was all written by U2. They do some good songs.
Sure. Yeah.
I bet out of an entire soundtrack, you'd get one good U2 song.
Probably, yes.
Yes.
Yes, I would say good. Yes.
Yeah. So anyway, that was a random tangent.
Yeah.
But let's talk about Uncharted.
No, Jonathan, before we talk about Uncharted, I have another random tangent. Because on the last podcast, where we were just talking about all this random stuff, I was going to talk about something, and then you immediately segued into the movie stuff. I want to talk about a couple of little tiny game things I played.
Okay.
That'll give us a chance to segue into our other video game discussion, which would be Uncharted.
Okay.
And this will be fairly brief, but I just wanted to mention, because I actually had completely forgotten that I was going to say anything about it until we got deep into the last podcast, and it would have been too awkward to bring it up then. So I'm going to bring it up now.
Awesome.
I played two things very briefly over the past week since the two podcasts ago, I guess. And that is, one, I played the Battleborn open beta because I'm just the guy who plays betas now. That has become my thing. I don't know how or why, but now I just see this beta's here, and I might as well play a little bit of it. And then I also played, because it was on PS Plus, and I was just intensely curious, I played Zombie, which is zombie with an I and not an E at the end. There's no E at the end, which is the launch game for the Wii U, Zombie U by Ubisoft, before they desperately just abandoned that console immediately.
There are still games they finished that they're not releasing because it would be too much of a money pit to print the discs.
Yeah, exactly. And so that title that they brought out there in fucking 2012 or whatever the Wii U came out, and they just ripped that U off the end, and they ripped out all the gamepad stuff, which apparently was very easy to do, based on playing the game, and they put it out on the current gen consoles. And so they put that out on PS Plus, so I paid no money. And I was curious enough to think, I might actually play this game. And then, probably 15 to 20 minutes in, I decided, no, I have had my fill. So I'm going to talk about Zombie first, which again, just everything about Zombie that I love is that it's so obviously a launch title for another console that had a very specific gimmick that just, like, didn't matter. It would be like if Uncharted Golden Abyss came out on the Xbox One, and it was just like, there's all of these little things in it that is like, this is the stupidest thing ever, of them trying to find some way to use a stupid gamepad thing, and, like, you can just do it with a button, and it is the exact same and 100 times more responsive. And all of that stuff starts with the title is so stupid that they just took the U off the end of it. Just Zombie with an I, like...
Which the Italian remake of Deus.
It's just Lucio Fulci's Zombie, which is a terrible zombie movie with a great cover, which if you've ever, like, went to Blockbuster, you probably saw the cover of, like, a rotting zombie guy with the word zombie without an E at the top. Don't ever watch that movie. It's fucking terrible. This game is better than that movie, with a little bit I've played of it. But yeah, so you start with the U got ripped off, and I'm playing Zombie on my PS4, and first of all, the game is set in London, and I thought that was kind of funny because they say, like, torch and stuff instead of flashlight, and it's all in the UI, and I there's just something weird about, like, seeing a UI prompt come up, and it's like, press B to activate your torch, and it's like, oh, right, London, cool. And so, yeah, it's set in London, and you wake up, and immediately you notice that the graphics do not look very good, and that was that moment where I was like, oh, right, the Wii U is like a 360 or PS3, only a little bit better. It is not. It's like, it was one of those, like, sort of gut check moments of, hey, the current generation of consoles has actually come a lot further than I thought in terms of graphic stuff, when all of a sudden I'm jumped into a game that feels like it was made for the last generation. So it's like, graphics do not look very good, and you just wake up, and immediately the most hilarious thing is they make such a big deal out of you going and finding your pad thing that is your mini-map. Like, they just put so much emphasis on you getting your mini-map, and it's like, it's a fucking mini-map. And I get it that, like, in the original version, the mini-map was all on the Wii U gamepad and not on the screen. But in this version of the game, you have this, like, British survivalist dude who's, like, sort of was walking you through the tutorial of the game. He's telling us, like, you have to go over there, and you gotta pick up this thing, and then it's like, you press this button, and then all of a sudden, it's like, there you go, it's your mini-map. And this map, it's very important. You have to pay attention to this map, and you're going to unlock a lot of things involving this map. So it's a mini-map, and it's just... In this version of the game, it's just a map in the corner of the screen like it's a fucking Call of Duty or something. It's like the little, like, details of emphasis they put on everything. Or, like, the other thing that's really big that I remember from the launch version reading about it was that it was all about, like, oh, your inventory's all on the gamepad, but everything happens in real time. So it's like you have to go into your inventory, and on your TV screen, the guy, like, takes out his backpack and is looking through stuff, but you have to look down at the gamepad or hold the gamepad up so you can see both at the same time. But you can just look at your gamepad, and that's where you do the inventory, and it's just intense and stressful, Jonathan, because everything's happening, but you're, like, looking at your gamepad to do your inventory stuff, and it's just, that's so different from how anything you could have on any other console. Jonathan, do you want to know how that works in this game? You press a button, and your inventory comes up, and behind your inventory, the game is just playing, and it is actually somewhat stressful to see a zombie coming at you while you're trying to get your gun, like, in your inventory all set up. Gamepad, kind of don't need it. It's pretty fucking superfluous. And that was more or less about as far as I got into the game in terms of, like, I killed a couple of zombies, I activated some CCTV cameras, because, again, it's London, and that updates your mini-map, because your mini-map, it's very... I don't know if I stress enough. The mini-map is important in this game. It tells you where stuff is in the environment. It's a mini-map, which is not something you get in games ever. Like, the gamepad in the Wii U invented the concept of mini-maps. We've never had mini-maps before. We haven't had since, other than Ubisoft, some genius engineer at Ubisoft found a way to make it work in this game without the Wii U gamepad. And I think we all need to praise their glorious efforts in doing that. So yeah, Zombie... Not a very good game.
It's the kind of thing where I do feel a little bad for Ubisoft because
yeah.
You have to recoup your investment on that. The Wii U didn't do it. Put it out as a PSN title.
Just put it on PS Plus. Who gives a shit?
Get that sweet PS Plus money.
Yeah.
Try to convert it. It seems like a no-win scenario in a lot of ways.
Yeah. It's not a very good game. It's not terrible. Like, I wouldn't say that, but it's just, there's nothing... it just very much plays like a launch title for an older console.
Well, absolutely, because you talk about by the end of the Wii U's lifespan, which we're close to, we have found some cool uses for the gamepad.
Yeah, sure.
As like inventory in Zelda, absolutely, that's a really good way to do it because you unclutter. That's one of the problems with some Zelda 3D games is the screens get cluttered.
Yeah, as someone who played Ocarina of Time on the N64, not the new version, like going into your inventory and switching out the iron boots all the time in the water temple was a disaster. That's like honestly the worst part about that whole thing. That's why that temple is as infamous as it is because it's a little bit confusing, and switching to your iron boots sucks.
It's the same. So it's the same principle as the Nintendo DS. Early DS games had that problem. Then they realized, this second screen can be useful in much more subtle ways.
Yeah.
And now we're deep enough into the 3DS era where I can't imagine a Nintendo handheld without it. So I don't think the Wii U ever got to that point, but good on the Zelda ones. Mario Maker, we've both played it. Obviously a masterstroke use of it.
Yeah, absolutely.
We'll see how Star Fox Zero pans out. That's kind of the last one to really make an effort. But yeah, those early ones where it's like, you're going to play it all on the gamepad, and you aim with the game, and you just get the gamepad.
Yeah.
No, didn't work.
Yeah,
Whatever team made that at Ubisoft, I just feel like it must have been soul draining.
Yeah, exactly. Especially when you realize like that because that was, if memory recalls correctly, that was like the most sort of critically acclaimed launch title that the Wii U had. Like other than like
Mario, but
yeah, but that was also like the 500th new Super Mario Brothers game that had come out at that point. But like, because like Zombie U was the one that was like, this is a third-party game that is actually kind of okay on this console. It was like maybe things will be okay because Nintendo had not done well with third parties since the N64, and so it's like it'd been a long time. And then like a week later, Ubisoft says like, no, we're done. Yeah, we're good. And EA put out like their Mass Effect 3 version on Wii U, and they're like, yeah, I think we're good.
We don't even know one or two on there, just three.
Yeah, exactly. It literally was just Mass Effect 3 on the Wii U launch. They're like, EA's like, yeah, we're done.
You remember Arkham City Armored?
Oh boy, do I. The fucking
Batman game with no frame rate?
Yeah, the Batman game with no frame rate, and all they could think to do with the Wii U gamepad was to put a button on it.
Okay, here's the funny thing. So a couple weeks ago, they had a sale in the Wii U shop, and it was a Ubisoft sale. I'm like, I have to look at this. What's the list of Ubisoft games I can buy for my Wii U?
Yeah.
There are more than I thought. You can get Assassin's Creed 4. You can get Assassin's Creed 3.
I didn't know Assassin's Creed 3, I remember, was one of the launch games for the Wii U.
And maybe I'm misremembering it. I thought 4 was on there, but at least 3.
3 definitely is.
And Watch Dogs is on there, all these ones. And
Watch Dogs Wii U, okay, I never knew that version of the game came out. It was delayed to hell.
Yeah, because they were on sale, I was really tempted to buy one just for fun and see what it would be like. And
I am pretty curious about what the Watch Dogs on Wii U is
but
like.
frankly, the file sizes were way too big, and I couldn't justify it because I don't have a lot of storage space on my Wii U.
As we've talked about numerous times at this point.
Yep. So anyway, I was like, no, maybe if I can ever get a disc for $5, I'll try that for fun. But anyway, that was kind of funny.
So that's Zomba. They ripped that U off the title, but they couldn't rip the U out of the game. I don't know. Put that on the back of the box. Then the other, like I said earlier, the other thing I played a little bit was the Battleborn open beta. I want to open this discussion with the tweet that Randy Pitchford, who is the CEO of Gearbox, who are the people who made Battleborn.
Can you remind me what Battleborn is? I don't.
Battleborn is not Overwatch, which is the multiplayer shooter, the class-based shooter that Blizzard is making. That is actually very different. It's not Paragon, which is the third-person shooter MOBA game that Epic is making. Battleborn is... I literally just forgot the title of the game and had to look at my phone at this tweet that I have loaded up to remember the title of the game. That's what just happened there. That was that weird pause. Battleborn is the first-person shooter MOBA-like co-op game by Gearbox, who are most famous for making Borderlands. That's what this one is.
Okay.
It's very hard to keep all these games straight. The only one out of those 3 games that just all were announced around the same time and feel very similar is Overwatch is actually getting some good press. It seems like it's a lot more like Team Fortress 2.
Overwatch is the one I want to play because it's Blizzard and I just have faith.
Yeah.
But
Battleborn, I'm going to before I go anywhere, I did not have a very good time with this beta. I don't think it's going to be a very good game. So that's why I want to open this discussion with, again, the tweet that Randy Pitchford, the CEO of Gearbox, who also in interviews has not come across as the most delightful of people, I will say that much. He had a tweet when they announced Battleborn, and it goes as follows. This is from July 2014. Battleborn is, FPS, hobby-grade co-op campaign, genre-blended, multi-mode competitive esports, meta-growth, choice plus epic Battleborn heroes, exclamation point, Jonathan.
Did Kanye West write that?
I think so. My favorite is hobby-grade co-op campaign, genre-blended, multi-mode competitive esports. That is a fucking mouthful. I can add a couple of more things to that list that Randy Pitchford left out because I get it, like the character limit on Twitter. Like, that's a pretty hefty tweet. You can also put boring, dull, uninventive combat, terrible humor, awful writing, and just overall, like, nonsense direction and no feedback for the player. So it's all of those things. That's what Battleborn is. And I don't think hobby grade is not. I wouldn't put hobby grade on there. Genre blended it has multiple genres. There is some choice. I don't even know what metagrowth means, so I'm not even going to talk about it. I think that might be the Dota thing of like you level up in the game, but that's only for that match, and then you also have like an account level that levels up that gives you bullshit because there's also microtransactions that are going to be in this game. It's nonsense. Don't worry about it. What Battleborn is two things. It is a first-person MOBA, and if you don't know what a MOBA is, Google it. I'm not going to explain it because it's fucking complex, and it's not done well here. If you want to play a MOBA, you can play League of Legends or Dota 2. They're the most popular games in the world for a reason, and it's a whole different thing. It's esports. This is not a good approximation of what a MOBA is, and it's that. It is also a sort of like class or character-based co-op campaign, like first-person shooter thing that like and that is mostly what I played. I tried to play some of the multiplayer stuff, which is the MOBA mode, and it wasn't very good. And I just like didn't really understand what was happening because the game gives you almost no feedback whatsoever. And I don't even mean didn't know what was happening in terms of there wasn't a good tutorial. I mean, I don't know what was happening because there's no good feedback in terms of like where you're getting shot from. The visuals are really bad because they're very cluttered, and so it's really hard to tell what enemies you're trying to shoot at because a MOBA basically means that there's going to be enemy-controlled players or player-controlled enemies, and there's also going to be like little AI enemies that sort of like rush at your base at a constant stream that you have to destroy before they blow up your base. That's like the gist of it.
If you want to know what a MOBA is, it's been leaking into all your favorite games like Titanfall and Halo 5. Like Warzone has some MOBA elements. Titanfall has MOBA elements. It's very popular with like PC gamers, and it's starting to get into console multiplayer.
Yeah, and it's just like like I said, League of Legends and Dota 2, those are like your MOBAs, and they are insanely popular on PC in their own little like world, and that's where like all the esports money and all that stuff is. And there are a lot of companies like Gearbox that are desperate to get that kind of money, so they're clutching at it by trying to make this hobby-grade, genre-blended, multi-meta-growth bullshit that is Battleborn, apparently. And so, like, I don't want to go on and on about this game because really, like, I don't think it's very good, but the beta is out, and I think it's going to be out for a little while so people can play it for themselves. But it really, like, what came down to, like, I bounced off this game so hard, and that, like, the first time I played it, I just got into a co-op campaign match because I couldn't get into the versus because, I just couldn't get into a server, and there's, like, a long wait time, and that was weird. And you, like, can select a whole bunch of heroes that have their own different abilities, and I just went with this one guy who's, like, a Space Marine-looking dude named Oscar Mike, because I was like, I can play a Space Marine and first-person shooter. I want to get, like, what looks like the most basic character. I don't want to jump into some, like, weird other characters that I played a little bit later. And so I jumped into this co-op campaign thing, and immediately what struck me is the writing in this game is so bad in, like, all levels. It's just terrible. And if you are someone who found the writing in Borderlands 1 and Borderlands 2 grating and obnoxious, like, which is a very fair opinion to have, this game takes that to, like, the whole other level where it's just, like, one of my Oscar Mike's special abilities, of which there are 3, is he shoots a grenade, which is one of the things that's my problem with the game, is all the special abilities are really boring. It's like, every character should be able to have, like, a grenade type ability where they just throw, like, a grenade type thing that does a different thing for every class. Like, because that just should be a thing to make the combat more interesting, because there's so little that you can do. Because, like, you have one weapon, you have 2 abilities, and a super ability that you don't unlock until late into the game. It's, like, just not interesting. There's not enough stuff that you can do as a player to change up your strategy. And so Oscar Mike can shoot a grenade with, like, the most boring special ability you could possibly give this character. And every time he shoots a grenade, he says, like, "Welcome to the nade party!"
Oh, God.
Literally. every single time, and you use that ability constantly because it's just shooting a grenade and it's on a cooldown. And he's like, every time that motherfucker says, "Welcome to the nade party."
I hate that kind of thing to begin with. It's why I've never even wanted to touch Borderlands, because
it's a fair perspective.
I can just tell that's the kind of thing that's not. I'm sure it's a good game, just not for me.
Yeah.
But it sounds like they've doubled down on it here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then, but like the worst part about it is that at least with Borderlands, particularly 2, because I played both those games and I like them a bit. Like they're not my favorite, but I enjoyed them. Like at least Borderlands 2, it felt like they were really trying with that game with the writing, and it's like it was hit or miss, and I think it missed more than it hit. But like there were missions in that game and jokes in that game that I thought were really funny. They were just like few and far between. In Overwatch, it just feels like they took that tone from Borderlands, but they're not even.
Nope, not Overwatch, Sean.
Fuck, god damn it. Battleborn. Not Paragon, not Overwatch, Battleborn. Motherfucker. Like, why did they announce these games at the same time? Why do they seem so similar, even if they kind of aren't? I don't know. It's frustrating for me. But yes, in Battleborn, they have the Borderlands tone, but without even trying. And so, like, throughout the entire thing, it's just, you're getting the same repeat jokes over and over and over again. You're getting these stupid voices that, like, are, like, attached to the mission dialogue that come into your ear. And they're just telling you, like, the worst dialogue of, like, just so lamely limping at some kind of joke about, like, oh, I'm going to send my spider robot to defeat you. And his name is Jeff. And the spider robot says, my name isn't Jeff. I am Arachnor, the destroyer of worlds, or something like that. It's like, oh no, your name is Jeff. It's like, I am Arachnor. And they basically do that joke, which is a joke that they've already made multiple times in Borderlands of like, I'm going to give this crazy thing a stupid, like, normal kind of name like George or something, and it's going to want to be called, like, Armageddon, destroyer of worlds or something. And, like, that's such a bad internet joke, like, the internet kind of joke to make all the time. But they just do that. It's like a 5-minute fucking sequence before you fight this boss. And then tell you, like, I am not Jeff. I am like, shut up, Jeff. Like, Jeff's going to kick your butt. And then, like, one of your guys comes on the radio and is like, man, that guy's really hung up about this Jeff thing. And it's like the delivery is terrible. The writing is terrible. It runs every joke it has into the ground with a fucking, like, sledgehammer. It is unbearable, the writing in this game. And it was like, I beat that boss fight, and like that, I had already been playing that mission for like 20 minutes. Like, these missions go on so long. I never finished one. I tried 3 times. I never actually got to the end. One time I was really committed, but then every other player dropped out at some point until I was the only one left, and so I just left. But the first mission I played, I got to that point, beat that boss fight that just took way too long to beat. And then I realized, oh, that's not the last boss fight. That's like the halfway point of this mission. I've been playing for 20 minutes. I can't stand this anymore. And I literally just turned the console off. And I don't think I've ever done this. I rage quit that game, not because something frustrating happened. Like, I didn't, like, fall off, like, get a cheap death or something, or, like, was playing a Dark Souls boss and was just getting really angry and frustrated because I couldn't beat him and, like, shut the console off. I've done rage quit like that before. I rage quit this game because I couldn't physically stand playing it for one more minute of just, like, not being able to take their annoying humor and their boring fucking gameplay any longer. I just turned the console off and I just left. I didn't play anything. I didn't play a video game again. I didn't load up my console again. I was just like, nope, I cannot do this. And a couple of days later, actually, because earlier today, I played it a little bit more to, like, I was like, I need to at least try the versus mode. I need to at least try a couple of other characters before I talk about it on the podcast. None of the other characters I played seemed very interesting. The versus mode was just completely incomprehensible. I couldn't tell if our team was winning or not because it just does not present information to you. And, like, I'm someone, like, I played Dota back in the day when it was like a Warcraft 3 mod. So I'm not, like, amazing at it, but I do have MOBA experience. Like, I can play them. I understand them. Like, I could not make heads or tails of what this fucking multiplayer was trying to give information to me about. Like, it was just completely incomprehensible. So, Randy Pitchford, your tweet is amazing. The stuff of Legends, it should be printed out and put in a museum somewhere, like, archived for history.
It should be printed inside every physical copy of the game.
Yeah, like, you should open it, like, that should be, like, you should have to thumb through that as a message that pops up with the first time you load up the game. Like, it's like the terms of service and that tweet. It's like, I love that tweet. That tweet is better than anything in your actual fucking video game. Holy shit, I hated that game. Don't play it.
All right, well, Sean,
Yeah.
We're going to talk about Uncharted.
Okay.
But first.
Yeah, let's talk about some good video games.
Wait a second. We're going to talk about a good video game, but
okay.
I'm realizing we're recording this all in one night,
yeah.
but this will be a weekly episode. We haven't talked about Digimon yet.
Oh, good catch. Yes. Yeah. Okay, yes.
Because we're keeping up our streak of you talking about betas
yes.
and Digimon.
Yeah.
Okay, Digimon Story Cyber Sleuth.
Great game.
Here's my topic for today.
Okay.
The music in that game is phenomenal.
Yeah, very good.
It's really good music. And it took a little while to grow on me and realize how good it is.
Yeah.
But it's really good. And I wish there were more of it. There's a lot of parts where you're just running around the city that are silent.
Yeah.
I just wish there was if I have one complaint about that game, I wish they had come up with some kind of little ditty that played while you're out in the city.
Yeah, yeah. Like a Your Affection style song.
But they get in, once in a while you'll do a dialogue or a boss, and this crazy, almost bluesy, vocal song will start, and it's awesome, and I want to hear more of it.
Yeah, yeah. There's definitely, and there's that one when shit gets really serious and there's this sort of almost creepy sound with the that vocal track plays.
Yes.
That's really good. That's a great song.
There are times playing this game where I would normally probably put on a podcast or something because it's where I'm more doing grinding or something, and I just want to hear the music. Yeah. It's just so much fun to hear the music. And I love the little sting at the end of every battle. It's, it's no Final Fantasy ending or anything, but it's great. Just all the music in this game. I've been looking for... I don't think there's a soundtrack for it. And I really wish there was.
Yeah. I would be kind of surprised if there was, because it's not a high-profile enough release, I think, to warrant it.
No, but they would be so cool.
I would want one, yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, just, if there's one ingredient that a good JRPG has to have, it's good music.
Yes, because if it doesn't, that will grate on you really hard, because you play those games for a long stretch of time.
Absolutely. You've got to... It's the Shoji Meguro rule, I think, where you have to come up with... You don't have to write hours and hours of music. You have to write music that you can listen to for hours and hours and not get tired of it.
Exactly.
And Digimon gets it.
Absolutely.
So, Digimon Story Cyber Sleuth, once again, thumbs up.
Yes, I'm glad we filled our quota.
Yes, absolutely.
We have to keep the streak going as long as possible.
All right. Well, speaking of good games...
Yes.
Let's talk about some of really the best games ever. And this is the Uncharted Trilogy... for the PlayStation 3 and now PlayStation 4 with the Nathan Drake collection. I think we'll talk about that collection specifically. We've talked about it a little. Maybe we'll do a little more at the end.
Yeah.
Just about why it is so good. But you can play it on PS4 now. I'm actually curious, because I got it in a bundle with my console. What does it cost, the actual game?
I think it's a full $60.
It is full $60,
I got it when it was on sale, so I didn't pay $60 for it.
Okay.
So I'm not 100% sure, but I feel like that's what the full price was.
I feel like it's worth it either way.
Yes,
but
it would be worth it.
Some people would ask because it's it's a collection of older games, but they're really good. You get 3 of them. And it's not just an upgrade; it's a little more.
Yeah, like what's really important about it isn't even necessarily that it's all 3 of those Uncharted games. It is that what they do to update them is really valuable, and it adds a lot to the experience.
Absolutely. So I have played them. I played them not quite all in a row. I took little breaks between them, but I played the whole Nathan Drake collection on my PS4. You've played it that way, but you also played them on the PS3 as a marathon back a couple years ago.
Yeah, I think 2 years ago, and we have that on record on podcasts. I remember having a fairly significant discussion because I played them all in a row then. I play them all in a row now. I actually really like playing those games, because they're pretty short, not short in terms of unsatisfying, but in terms of actual time it takes. They're not that long, and so you can just get them in really quick, and I feel like they build off of each other in a way that's very satisfying.
Yes, and that's where I want to start with our discussion of Uncharted, because playing these games was a real revelation for me in a bunch of ways, and one of them was realizing how utterly these games eclipse all Hollywood adventure movies for me.
Right.
Not quite all in the past, but definitely in the present and future. Naughty Dog, what they did here is so above and beyond in taking what was a cinematic genre, adapting it to video games, and making it better, that it's going to be really tough to see, like we said before, Indiana Jones 5 in a world that now has Uncharted 3.
Yeah.
It would just be tough to see that and see it, even if it's done really well. Uncharted has kind of evolved on that in a way that is so fascinating. And there are lots of ways we could tackle how they do that. The number one thing to me, though, is that across these 3 games, they set up main characters and they let them evolve.
Yes.
That is a problem in James Bond movies. It's a problem in the Indiana Jones movies. It's a problem in a lot of Hollywood adventure movies, which is where the characters stay static, or in Indiana Jones, they change a little bit, but not all that meaningfully.
Yeah.
And what happens in Uncharted is that in Game 1, you meet Elena and Nathan and Sully,
Yeah.
and their relationships are really interesting in that game. And then you come back in Game 2, and I think the thing that really, probably more than anything, made Uncharted 2 such a hit at the time is that if you play Drake's Fortune, you play Among Thieves, and now Elena and Nathan have moved on, and there's something new to their relationship. And by the end of that game, they are in a very different place emotionally than they were at the start.
Yeah.
And Sully and Nathan, their relationship changes in a way that is also really fascinating and evolves, and you learn more about them. And then in Uncharted 3, I think they take that to a whole other level in terms of, Elena and Nathan get married and break up and get back together, and his flaws they go under the microscope in a way that action heroes are almost never held to task for. Mm-hmm. It actually, I think, is a very progressive game gender-wise, if we want to get into that, and how it treats the male and female characters, and that what we view as the male archetype is not automatically good just because it is the archetype. And, Nathan's relationship with Sully as the father figure goes somewhere. And by the end of those 3 games, it feels like these characters have changed so much as the world and the, technology of the games changes around them. And so that journey is satisfying in a way that if you marathoned all 3 Indiana Jones films, you just spent some hours watching fun movies. Nothing really changed over those 6 hours.
Yeah.
I've done that. I went to a marathon of those, and it wasn't all that fun because you realize one after another, I kind of just watched the same movie twice, and then Temple of Doom is its own thing. But still, it's like there wasn't any evolution there. In the Uncharted games, there is major evolution, and if there's anything that looks exciting about Uncharted 4, it seems like they made that under the decision of, we're going to do an actual ending.
Yeah.
And that never happens in these kind of stories.
Mm-hmm.
They have taken the archetype and blown it up in a way that I think is so fascinating that I don't think it's even ever been fully reckoned with in scholarship on these games.
Yeah, I agree, yeah. And it's something where, specifically, when you're thinking about, how they track that, is that in Uncharted 1, it is, and it's still, today, going back to it, it's still, head and shoulders above most games in terms of, character writing and pacing and that kind of stuff. And they established Nate and Elena. I keep on wanting to call her, Ellie, because of Last of Us. It's, there's such similar names. The Nate, Elena, and Sully, they established them and they evolved them through the course of that game. And then, but what's I think the real revelation is when you're playing Uncharted 2, and the way they set this up, everything about the beginning of Uncharted 2 is such a masterstroke with the in medias res stuff and the whole train sequence. I'll talk about that later. But what's really important in terms of us talking about the characters is when you get to that point, a third of the way through the game, when you're in that Middle Eastern city, I believe, and that's where you meet up again with Elena for the first time in that game, and up until that point, you don't necessarily I basically knew when I played the game. I'm sure you knew because how much sort of information you cover
I actually had no idea about Sully or Elena, and I only knew about Nathan Drake.
Okay, so unless you sort of gain this information by osmosis, you have no idea if Elena is going to be in this game at all, or if this game is going to acknowledge her, because the Indiana Jones movie, Temple of Doom, is a prequel, but you only know that because of weird movie trivia. It's not apparent because of what's in the movie really. And Temple of Last Crusade has basically no connection to Raiders or Temple of Doom. Marion from Raiders does not carry over until you get to Indiana Jones 4, and there it feels kind of weird to bring her up all of a sudden when she's been gone for more movies than she's been in.
You can't have one true love if you break up and fuck 10 other women.
Exactly.
It's not a thing.
And so with Uncharted 2, one of the things that's very interesting is when you start up, because obviously the main reference point for movies for these games are the Indiana Jones movies, that they wear that influence on their sleeve. So when you get to Uncharted 2 and Elena's nowhere to be found, you think oh, maybe they're just doing that thing. And it's they introduce Chloe, and she's got a sort of new love interest kind of vibe to her. And Sully's there, but Sully feels like he's the John Rhys Davies character at that point, kind of. You don't necessarily fully understand how important he is. That was one of the most surprising things about going back to Uncharted 1, is that Sully doesn't necessarily feel like the character that I remembered yet, because it's I had played through all of them, and you get so much stuff in Uncharted 3 that I'm holy shit, Sully's barely in Uncharted 1 and 2. He's in it, but not that much. But you get to that point about a third of the way through the game, and that's when Elena comes back in, and it's very clear all of a sudden, they aren't just ignoring that story. Like, they aren't just ignoring Elena as a character and putting in a new love interest in the vein of, like, Temple of Doom and Last Crusade. Instead, like, they sort of pull this bait and switch on you, make you think that's what they're doing. But really, like, that attitude that Nate has for that, like, first section that feels like, oh, that's good old Nathan Drake, and it's like he's, like, hit the reset button. That's not just like this is very convenient for storytelling because we can just do the same thing again with this character the way you do with Indy in the indie movies. It's like, no, that's actually a deliberate storytelling choice we made with this character, is to make you kind of feel like, oh, it's old Nathan Drake up to his adventures, but where's Elena? That's kind of weird. And Elena comes in and you're like, oh, okay, this is Nate up to his old adventures in a way that's not a good thing. Like, that's him running away.
Nathan Drake is someone who thinks he's in an Indiana Jones movie, and he's not.
Yeah.
He thinks he is someone up to a point. He becomes self-aware, but he thinks he can be in the cycle where he can just be himself forever with no consequences.
Yeah.
And that is his ultimate character flaw, is that he is perpetually up over his head.
Yes.
Like, he is in the shit, and he gets there before he realizes it, and he's always in too deep. And at a certain point in Uncharted 2, and I think this is the brilliant turn, is he becomes aware of it, and he starts to kind of regret it in some way, and it's something he has to reckon with, and it's why, and I think we'll come back around to this at the end of our discussion, Uncharted 4 seems like it is something so essential for Naughty Dog to do beyond keeping an interesting IP alive, which is that if you don't get to the point where you end that story in some definitive way, whether that's Nate dying, which I hope they don't do, but I think they could make it work if they wanted, or it's Nate overcoming some of these flaws more definitively, you have to do that for the story they've set up, because that is the story.
Yeah.
You have to have a thief's end if you've had the thief doing what he's done in these 3 games.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah. So let's talk about Nathan Drake.
Okay.
I mean, Nathan Drake, you could easily make the argument, and I would not disagree with it necessarily, that this is Nolan North as Nathan Drake is the best vocal performance in any American game. Yeah. You could totally, I might pick someone else, but if someone I'd be like, good choice if you want to make that your number one. And it's more than just Nolan North, but you kind of have to start and end with him, because the amount of character he imbues into that character from moment one on the boat in Drake's Fortune to the very end of Uncharted 3 is insane. It is off the charts. It is just, you love that character absolutely 100% from the beginning, while he also feels like a three-dimensional, flawed human being. And obviously so much of that goes to the Naughty Dog writing. It is fantastic. And their vision for that character is so precise and interesting. But then just, Nolan North can make any piece of writing sound like an improv. And it's something that is so important in those parts of the game where you're just running around doing puzzles and he and Sully will banter. They're some of my favorite moments in video games ever. And it sounds so off the cuff and natural. And I think natural is something that, ironically, for a series that has a lot of big, unrealistic moments, has some of the most extreme ludonarrative dissonance in any game ever. All this stuff. There's something about those characters and their interactions that feels so naturalistic to me.
Yeah, and I think there's like a lot of stuff that does go into that, where you obviously, like, the writing is great, like, you know, like, and it improves pretty substantially through each of the games. Then eventually, like, for us where we are right now, the cap for that is The Last of Us, where, like, you see that, like, their ability to write very naturalistic dialogue into these not very natural worlds, because like Uncharted takes place in like our world with like if every like supernatural thing was actually real and a third act twist kind of way, in the way that Indiana Jones takes place in the real world, but then like you open up a thing and everyone's faces melt. So it's not really the real world. And then Last of Us takes place in the apocalypse, and they're able to inject their characters with a very sort of, like you said, like there's almost no other word for it other than naturalness. There's a human quality to the dialogue, that it doesn't just feel like it's people walking around spouting lines, and like with my Battleborn thing of like where that all that dialogue feels like it's so scripted and so awkward. It's all just like, go get them, Jeff. It's instead like everything that Nate says and Sully says and Elena says feels like something those characters would say as people in these ridiculous scenarios. And a lot of that dialogue is them reflecting on like, this, oh God, like this shit's, that's a tank in this town. Oh my god! That's half of Nate's dialogue. That's like, you don't remember that because the more memorable lines are the quiet moments. But that's like half of Old Norse Traum is just running around going like, oh fuck, shit, fuck, oh god, oh god, oh god, oh god, everything's welling up around me. Why does every single ledge I step on collapse? This is just unnatural for a human being at some point. This just feels really unfair. I realize I spend a lot of time in very brittle places, but there's a point at which it just becomes ludicrous. And it's like, that's the sort of Nathan Drake qualities, that he's able to run into these scenarios and feel like a human being, even though no human being could do what he would do, and no human being would be in any of these situations. At the same time, when he is climbing up the train from the beginning of Uncharted 2, and it's like he's bleeding and he's dying, like, at least I certainly wasn't really thinking about how, like, oh, he gets shot all the time. Like, this is ridiculous. I was like, this is the one time he gets shot and it's a big deal. It's like there's certain video games that try to do that and it doesn't work. Here, it's Nate's reaction feels so real from the writing, the animation, which is really important, and Nolan North, who, like, there is a very good reason that he and his performance as Nathan Drake started this modern era of, like, the minor celebrity of the voice actor. That, like, you never knew any voice actor's name before Uncharted that worked in video games, unless you were, like, a weird guy who liked looking up, like, voice actors in cartoons and anime, because all that carried over to video games. It's like, now, it's not uncommon for someone who plays these games to know, like, Troy Baker's name, to know Nolan North's name, and, like, maybe even be able to recognize them if you show them a picture.
Right, and it's something that I think Naughty Dog is so uniquely good at in American games, and this will be a big theme in our discussion today, which is that they can mix the video gamey and not being unafraid to just be a video game and have, Nathan Drake is going to shoot a lot of people. No. Does it make sense with his character? No, but it's a game and you have to do that.
Yeah.
Does it make sense for every single ledge to collapse? No, but that's not the fucking point. Yeah. And you can mix that with very real pathos in a way that makes it feel utterly naturalistic and not distracting at all. And it can be a good game and a good story in a way that is so seamless, it's breathtaking if you take a second to think about it, which is hard to do because it is so seamless. You don't get those chances very often.
Yeah.
And we're going to have to come around to The Last of Us a couple times in this discussion because it is just, I think you have to. It's the ultimate result of the Uncharted games in a very weird way. But you don't get The Last of Us without Uncharted, and The Last of Us is kind of that pinnacle of mixing the video game side with the character side in a way where suddenly it becomes more seamless than ever.
Yeah.
But it's something like Naughty Dog is just, in the American video game scene, I think very uniquely good at. Like, I think in Japan has, I think, had some of this in story-based games for years. You look at, like, Persona and how they mix the video gamey with the emotionally real.
And, like, the themes of the story.
Yeah, it's very good. The Witcher, which is Polish, something like that. But, I'm just thinking of, like, AAA games these days. It's tough to come to mind with someone who does this particular combination in this way. It is so signature Naughty Dog.
Yeah.
And going back to the theme of Nathan Drake and that character, you talk about all those moments where, again, a lot of Nate's lines are reacting to crazy things going on.
Yeah.
And yet there comes a point, and I think you recognize it a little bit early on, and it gets more and more real the further you get in the series, where those moments can be very funny, and they can be very engaging, but they can also be laced with pathos.
Yeah.
And laced with this sense of, at a certain point, you realize where Nathan Drake's flaws lie, and he probably knows it too. And at the point where the tank is running through the town, it's also something where it's like, I have to figure my shit out.
Yeah. It's like things have escalated drastically in this scenario, and I am fighting a tank. People aren't supposed to fight tanks on foot. That's not a thing people do.
But you know what I mean? Like, I love the first scene of Drake's Fortune because it is so small scale. It's just him and Elena on the boat.
Yeah.
It's him being a scoundrel, but it's not Indiana Jones. Even from that first moment, you can realize it's not just he's a scoundrel. He's a scoundrel who has something more going on underneath with him claiming to be the descendant of Francis Drake.
Yeah.
With him going to find, with Elena, this, what were they finding at the beginning of?
It's a casket with a map in it that's supposed to be Francis Drake's tomb, but it's not. It's just like a clue.
Yeah, so they're finding the clue. He's manipulating Elena as a journalist. He's manipulating a lot of people. And yet that cockiness, I think from that very first moment, you can realize there's something more to it. There's probably something emotional going on there. Yeah. And I think Naughty Dog clued in on that very quickly. And, by the time you get to Uncharted 3, it's the theme of that game, which is where do those things come from in him, and that he is a fundamentally good person. He will always try to do the right thing, even though he is a thief and all these things.
Yeah.
But seeing some of that emotional pain, and that they never go too far into it. They're never really doing like armchair psychoanalysis of Nathan Drake. All you need is just those little intimations that he's probably not actually Francis Drake's, descendant.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And stuff like that, and you just kind of feel it. And he's such an interesting and multi-dimensional character for those reasons.
Yeah, that it is, I mean, as you said earlier, like, he's not Indiana Jones, and he wants to think of himself as being this hero, but it is very clear from the very beginning that, like, because there's like a certain quality of that sort of Harrison Ford, Han Solo, Indiana Jones character that has that sort of vaguely bumbling aspect to them. I think like Han Solo has that great scene in A New Hope where he's at the console in the prison chamber in the Death Star, and he's trying to like talk to those guys as like boring conversation anyway after he shoots the comm channel. And it's like, there's a bit of that, but I feel like Nate takes that aspect of those characters and like pushes them a lot further to make them a lot more relatable, where it's like, Indy like can get beat up a bit, and he tells us a couple of jokes, and he makes some mistakes. And it's like, he has like he falls into the pit, and it's like snakes. I hate snakes, and that stuff. It's got a bit of that, but Nate feels like he's all that. Like he feels like he's all this like very flawed human that is making these mistakes all the time, and he is not like this super cool guy that says all these super cool lines and gets all the girls all the time. It's like he's bumbling into every situation he's getting into. He's always in over his head. Like, people are like manipulating him, deceiving him, and he's getting betrayed and stuff like in Uncharted 2. And it's like he kind of has no idea what he's doing ever. And he's like, in the course of all these games is him trying to figure his shit out. And like he just gets a little bit further each time. In
a very human way.
Yes, yeah.
Change is not something where you flip the switch and everything's okay. And I think that's maybe going to be the theme of Uncharted 4 based on what we've seen is, obviously, if you look at the overall structure of the trilogy, he goes a very long way in those 3 games, but each piece is kind of glacial in its progress.
Yeah.
And then by Uncharted 4, well, what do you do when you're on the other side of that? I think is the question that the marketing has been posing, and I find a very interesting moral dilemma for that game to maybe be built upon.
Yeah.
But within these games themselves, as you say, I think he is someone who wants to think he's one-dimensional, but he's more than that.
Yeah.
He wants to be the legendary hero, and in some ways he does things that, as you say, no human being could ever possibly do, but he is human underneath that.
Yeah.
And it's so interesting. And, of course, that's where you have to talk about Elena, because the way they use her is so fascinating. And I think she's great in Uncharted 1. I love all of their interplays. Like, if you were to just look at Uncharted 1, I don't think you would guess that him and Sully would be the famous pair in these games.
Yeah.
You would think, in terms of just like dialogue and banter, it's him and Elena in that first one. But I also don't think you would think their romance would go as far as it does and as interesting and human as it does. Because it's something where you don't feel completely bad for Elena getting in bed with this guy.
Yeah.
Because clearly there's something they fulfill in one another, but it's also not a perfect destiny, stars-aligned romance.
Yeah.
It's somewhere in the middle, and I love that it never goes on this one extreme or the other, where you can have Uncharted 2 be this kind of push and pull where, while you're playing Uncharted 2, I had no idea if it would really realistically end with them getting together or something.
Yeah.
It could go either way, and the way it does end, which is them getting together by going back to their banter beyond anything else. I love that final scene of Uncharted 2.
That final scene of Uncharted 2 is amazing.
It's amazing. It feels so fulfilling because it feels like something has happened to both of these people in a way where they're finding things out about each other by being together, which is what a good relationship is.
Yeah. Yeah, it's with Elena, like I said before, I think the best part about her is that, like, you miss her so much at the beginning of Uncharted 2, and
Absolutely.
that is, like, in a way that, like, the first time I watched the Indiana Jones movies and had no idea, like, anything about the supporting cast, and I, like, watched Raiders of the Lost Ark, and then I watched Temple of Doom, because the first time I watched those movies, I basically watched them back to back. And when I got to Temple of Doom, I wasn't thinking, like, where's Marion all the time? Like, that was never... It's like, she's fine in Raiders. Like, she's not a bad character. I like her. She serves, like, the function in that movie very well. But, like, there's nothing about her character that's, like, so memorable that you want to see her, and her relationship with Indy isn't so memorable that you want to see her over and over again. But with Elena, it's like you're at the beginning of Uncharted 2, And that starts off with, like, you know that shit is going to go real sour at some point, and there's that sense of sort of dread, but the entire time you're seeing Nate, like, flirt with Chloe, you see him getting into this scenario where you know things are going to turn bad. From minute one, you know he's getting played. You know that this, I can't even remember, that British fucker. Harry, yeah, you know that he's a piece of shit because he's a British guy. Like, come on, like, he's like the one British guy in that whole game. Of course he's going to be a piece of shit. Like, the British dude in Uncharted 1 was a piece of shit. Like, people who have British accents in these action, like, adventure stories tend to be assholes. How do you not see that, Nate? And you're, like, seeing that the entire time. And, like, the first time I played these games, and even the second time now, like, knowing how it happens, when I get to the beginning of that game, in the back of my mind, like, the first question I always ask is, like, dude, where's Elena? Like, what happened? And it's weird because the way Uncharted 1 ends isn't even, like... It doesn't end with them, like, kissing and having this huge romantic moment. It more feels like there is a romantic connection there, but, like, they're kind of... It more feels like, hey, we're cool. Like, we're buddies is kind of like what the end of Uncharted 1 feels. But that we're, even without it trying to be, like, the big Hollywood romance, or maybe because it's not trying to be that, you do have that, like, connection of, like... You know, like, Nate needs Elena, and without her there, he's screwed. And that is, like, the theme of these games, is that, like... Elena is basically fine on her own. It seems like she's, like, kind of lonely when he's not around, but it's like she's more or less okay. Like, she can handle herself. Nate can't. Like, he needs, like, a more controlling presence in his life that understands him.
And let's talk about archetype for a minute here, because obviously the DNA of Indiana Jones and Marion are in these two characters.
Yes.
And if you look at Raiders of the Lost Ark, on an archetypal level, the brilliance of that movie is in unlocking that idea where the woman is kind of like the man, and their crazy kind of matches each other in a way that is complementary. So even if she's a damsel in distress at one moment, it doesn't feel completely shoehorned in or something because she's still active. And for the time, you know, big deal.
Yeah,
and you know, I don't know if progressive's the perfect word, but yeah,
for the time,
yeah,
for the time. Like even now, kind of hard to find like female characters that are that like.
Active in the story.
And like, don't just get like kidnapped 100 times.
Well, it's someone who Indiana Jones loves and respects for being strong.
Yeah.
You know, and if you think about Raiders comes from Steven Spielberg wanting to direct a James Bond but not getting to.
Right.
At that point in the James Bond series, you hadn't gotten there yet with the women.
Right.
I forget when Spy Who Loved Me is, but that's probably when that starts, although I think even that actress was dubbed. So, you know, if you take the actress's voice away, progressive is not a thing going on.
When do they stop just hiring supermodels instead of actresses? When did that happen?
I mean, it still hasn't stopped.
That's kind of
in some cases. I don't know. It depends. It depends on which Bond girl you're talking about because there's multiple per movie. But yeah, so that was the idea that the male hero could be attracted to the woman because she is strong and independent and cool, and kind of he recognizes things in her that he values too. Yeah. I think that was kind of a new thing for an adventure movie like that.
Yeah.
But those are the archetypes. Here, it's on the surface the same idea, where Nathan Drake is the cocksure dude, always in over his head, but can always get out of it.
Yeah.
And Elena is someone who also wants that life of adventure. She wants to travel. She wants to find out things. They are both fundamentally explorers. They just want to learn and kind of gather, not even knowledge, but experience, you know? And they both are in for that. They are always in for an adventure. But then there's those little differences between them, which is that Elena kind of knows when to quit.
Yeah.
And it's not because she is any less of a hero or any of this stuff. It's that there's something broken in Nate that is not broken in her.
Yeah.
And as you say, she can be okay on her own. I think her life, if Nate, fell off a cliff or something, she would recover and probably be okay.
Yeah.
Nate without Elena would just either go on enough adventures to where he got shot and killed, or he would drink himself to death. You know, there's no upside to him.
I mean, it's like, but because that is like the beginning of Uncharted 2 and 3, where like he's like has that very troubled relationship and he's sort of disconnected from her a little bit. And that's always when you join his life is when like it feels like he's gone the farthest away from her in that period in his life, and that's always when it's like he's making the stupid choices. It's like, you shouldn't be doing this, you fucking idiot. And it's only when Elena comes in that's like, he can start getting pulled into a, hey, maybe kind of stop, or if you are going to do this, think about the consequences. Because that's another part of the Elena character that I really like that evolves, I think, very subtly over the course of the games. Whereas in Uncharted 1, she's a lot more just cut from the same cloth as Nate, where like, she's like a camera woman for like that TV show or whatever it is that they sort of like allude to. That's why she is there. And so that's like a more of like, it feels like she's there for like thrill-seeking purposes. But then in Uncharted 2 and Uncharted 3, her role in the world feels like she is this daring reporter, kind of like a Lois Lane sort of figure, where she is like in like these areas where there are civil wars and military conflicts and stuff, and trying to like report on them. And there's a certain moral quality to what Elena does that feels like, while Nate's not a bad guy, it feels like he generally isn't taking the moral part into consideration. And that's like when Elena comes in and push comes to shove, like she sort of pushes him in like Uncharted 2, like maybe you should be thinking about like what is happening with this treasure. Like what are the consequences? Like why are people after this? And not just being like, hey, let's discover this stuff because it's cool. And maybe it's more like this stuff is like lost for a reason. And it's that presence of the game that I really love.
And she evolves on her own trajectory.
Yeah.
You know, you talk about her being someone who seems very a mature part of the world. Well, she matures. You know, in the first one, she's kind of, as you say, a bit of a thrill seeker. Second, she's a journalist who's probably in over her head, and she will be the first to admit that.
Yeah.
That war zone probably wasn't the right place to go. And by Uncharted 3, she's clearly very savvy and knows how to navigate the world she finds herself in. You know, she's in, I think is it Yemen you're in Uncharted 3?
Yes, it is, yeah.
Yeah, and she very clearly, like, she's not in any trouble in Yemen. She fits in there, she knows what to do.
She speaks the language, she, like, can handle herself, like, she knows where to go, she knows the people.
Yeah, all of that. And I think this is super important to note on the gender level. Other than the beginning of Uncharted 1, she is never where she is because of Nathan Drake.
Yeah.
Nathan Drake finds her, and in some ways I think is drawn to her because he needs her.
Yeah.
But she does not come and rescue him, or she's not there because he dragged her there, or any of those reasons. She's in that. It's a big coincidence in Uncharted 2.
Yeah.
But it's a coincidence you buy because both characters have agency in it.
Yeah, and they're both, like, sort of after the same thing for slightly different reasons. That, like,
yes.
It makes sense that if they're both sort of, like, chasing these sort of like adventures in these like this high stake danger situation from different angles, that they would run into each other at some point.
Absolutely. And then in Uncharted 3, it's just because they need a certain person at a certain time in a certain place, and Elena happens to be there, and Nate kind of has to swallow his pride and go talk to her. And I also love that the way they characterize Elena's relationship whenever Nate comes crawling back, for lack of a better term, is so interesting and nuanced. The way they write that and the way Emily Rose, the actress, plays it is... I don't think she's ever just automatically brushing off the things he's done. Because you get a sense that in all their breakups, it wasn't because probably any one horrible thing happened. It's because there were just certain things that went on.
Yeah.
Probably on both sides. Mm-hmm. But then he comes back. She's both welcoming to him, friendly. It's never like the standoffish, totally stereotypical, just she's being... You know, just standing in a corner.
Yeah, it's not like she like walks up and does like the Jack Sparrow, like she slaps him in the face and the like reverse angle of his face, like coming into the camera thing.
No, they never do that. And yet, when she starts hearing about what Nate's up to, the harder edge comes out because she knows he can be better. It's not because she takes this personally and has a grudge to fulfill. It's because she does love this person and she wants him to be the best version of himself.
Yeah. It's like that moment in Uncharted 2 where they find each other and then Chloe comes in and like they were just talking about Lazarevich and Chloe says like, we need to catch up to Lazarevich, and then Elena just goes, oh, Nate. Like, it's just like that moment of like, God damn it, like how are you involved with this like mass murdering war criminal? What is going on? Nate.
Also just... From a writing standpoint, how much of the story takes place in between the games and is conveyed so naturalistically. Mm-hmm. Again, like I love in Uncharted 3 when you get... It's a pretty long stretch of the game before you get to Yemen.
Yeah, it's like the whole first half. Really.
Yeah, and then you get there and you find out they're married and estranged but still want to be together without any of those things being literally addressed.
Yeah, just, like the conversation with like the rings, like that's like a really, really clever like pair of scenes. Just
the fact that they both have... held onto their rings in different ways and ostensibly for other reasons, but you know the real reason.
Yeah.
And it's such smart writing. Mm-hmm. It's such smart writing that you can have significant portions of character development be ellipses in between the games and not feel cop-out. Like it's a cop-out.
Yeah, it's just that thing that like it's hard in like anything, even movies and books, but especially in video games, it is really hard to find those moments to tell the story, especially in like an action game, like in an RPG. Like those moments are everywhere. Like that's half the game is like having those moments. But in like something like a Halo or a Call of Duty or Uncharted or Gears of War, and like all these stories that like some of them, like Halo's pretty successful at it, Call of Duty, like, is hit or miss depending on the game. Gears of War never fucking figured that out. It's like, understandably, it's really hard because you have a lot of people making these games, a lot of moving parts, and, like, having to figure out, like, having those quiet moments is so important to the pace of the game. So it's important in a, like, gameplay and game feel aspect. But it's what is needed for the story. And Gears of War never got it. Like, the latter, like, Halo 5 never got it. A bunch of Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 never got it. And Uncharted, all of those games absolutely understand this. Like, you have big, crazy action sequences, and then you have long sequences where it's just, like, there's maybe a puzzle, or maybe even not. Like in Uncharted 3, you have that whole sequence of when you first get to Yemen, where you're just walking with Sully and Elena, walking through that town, talking about what's going on, and there's a couple of things you run into where it's like, oh, I need to, like, knock this thing down, we can go over this way. But for the most part, it's just walking around having character dialogue.
And those are the moments where you can feel The Last of Us coming.
Yeah.
You can feel it, like, building inside Naughty Dog, and that they're eventually just going to make a game that is all in between moments.
Yeah.
Even the big action scenes are in some ways in between moments in the larger stories of these people's lives.
Yeah.
You know?
You're just waiting for Elena to get a pun book so that you can read it to you every time you have one of those quiet walking around moments.
Exactly. It is a fascinating trajectory for that company, almost being shocked by their own creative success and then building on it, you know?
Yeah.
It's really interesting. So, the third piece of the Uncharted trifecta is, of course...
My personal favorite.
Sully.
Victor goddamn Sullivan.
He is so great.
He is a fucking amazing. I mean, there is a reason why he only has a small appearance in Uncharted 1. He has a little bit bigger appearance in Uncharted 2. And Uncharted 3 is all about that glorious son of a bitch.
Absolutely it is.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the really impressive thing about Uncharted 3, we'll get to it, is it's all about Sully, but it's also kind of all about Elena, but it's also really all about Nate.
Yeah.
Somehow it got to be about all three characters.
Yeah, it nails that trio perfectly. It,
Yes.
balances them better than any of the previous games did.
Like, it's the kind of thing where that's why Uncharted 3 would work as a conclusion if Naughty Dog decided they never wanted to put a finer point on it. That would be a perfectly fine trilogy capper.
Yeah.
Because it does it all very well. I'm glad they're deciding to put the finer point on it, because
Yeah.
I think that's needed. But it's got that balance that is so important. But,
Yeah.
Sean, you talk about Sully all the time. So why is Sully so great?
Well, because Sully's great because of, like, with all these other characters we're talking about, it feels like Sully fits into that archetype of that sort of, like, grizzled mentor figure to Nate, of, like, this other adventure kind of guy who's, like, kind of been in the game longer than Nate. Nate sort of feels like his protege, and, like, that becomes a lot more explicit later on. But, like, and with Uncharted 1, it just feels like Sully is this real good guy who's been around the block, and he's the guy who's been with Nate, that they, like, have all their little moments in the game where they talk about, like, man, like, what were you doing? This reminds me of what you did down in Borneo, like, that one time. And, like, they get to have, like, all these, like, quiet adventures that they had in between games or before the games at all, that, like, they get to relate to one another. And that's, like, such a great character archetype. Like, I love those characters. I mean, it's the reason why The Last Crusade is my favorite Indiana Jones movie, is because of Sean Connery in that movie as Indy's dad is so great. And he's basically this kind of character. The guy who's, like, seems like he should be out of the game at this point, but somehow, man, he's still in it, and somehow he still is able to do it better than those youngins. You know, that's the kind of character that Sully is. And he is that presence in Uncharted 1, and he is that presence in Uncharted 2, and he's great both of those times. And he is that figure, like, almost kind of opposite in some ways, Elena in his life, where Elena is they're both stabilizing influences, but Elena feels like she's a stabilizing influence that's sort of, like, pulling him away, and Sully's a stabilizing influence that can kind of pull him back in a bit. That's, like, is a good thing for Nate and a bad thing for Nate, because he can be a role model, and that's great for Nate, and, like, have this, like stalwart companion that's with him, like, it always has his back. But at the same time, it's like Sully's never been able to get out of that life, and, like, that's, like, the situation you have him in Uncharted 1, where they almost, like, do a, like, sort of half villain twist, or like gesture towards a villain twist with him before they pull back and be like, no, he's really been awesome the entire time. Don't worry. He's way too cool. Like, look at that mustache. He can't be a bad guy. Right. But it is that, like, you know, he has, like, bad deaths all the time. He's the guy who, like, ends every adventure. Like, he's grabbed the treasure somewhere, and he's got it in the boat at the end of Uncharted 1. That's fucking great. And the end of Uncharted 3 has, like, an amazing callback to that moment. And it's like he's that guy in Nate's life. And that's just great, because I just, like I said, that Last Crusade is my favorite Indiana Jones movie. I love that character archetype so much. But especially once you get to Uncharted 3, that's when I feel like they really pull back the curtain on the Sully character and do for him what they'd always been doing for Nate and Elena, which is complicate him and get in there and sort of like see like, what is this guy really? And you get like those hints at it of him having like the debts and stuff that like are never fully paid. And when you get the flashback sequences in Uncharted 3 and see how he met Nate and that quality of him, that it's like, you get this impression that he wants to have this better life, and he's like, but he's been in a bad life for way too long, and he's already older than we've ever seen Nate is by the time like he runs into Nate, right? Like he's been in this life, he's like 40 years old or something like that by the point he meets Nate. It's like he's been in this life the entire time. He's never found that way out. And you get that real sense of pathos with him when you compare that with where he is now, and he's like, he is actually seriously too old for this shit. And that's obviously like a cliche. When you get to that point, you have all those moments in Uncharted 3 that are great in how what they build up to near the end of that game, of like Elena taking him to the side and stuff like that. It's just like, dude, like, Sully's not invincible. Like, he's not going to be around forever. Like, he's this mortal guy who's in your life that, like, he always has your back. And like he's been like sort of teaching you and leading you in your life, and it's your turn to do that kind of for him. It's your turn to be the one that's going to back off, because he's going to go to hell for you, and you're the guy who has to decide not to go to hell. Like, that's your choice. And it's that progression with that character that sort of really shines a light on that sort of codependent relationship that they have and the agency that Nate needs to find in it. That's like, that's what makes Uncharted 3 the best Uncharted game for me.
Uncharted 3 is an emotional knockout on every fucking level, and it is because they understand those three relationships, and that the entire back half of that game is motivated by Nate wanting to do right by Sully, Elena wanting Nate to do right by himself, and Nate also wanting to do right by Elena, who is the person he kind of aspires to be. Like, if anything, they are both role models for him, and he has to find the happy medium between them to be him, the best version of himself. And, I mean, we'll get to Uncharted 3. It's the reason why I think the overshadowing of Uncharted 3 by Uncharted 2 is one of the great critical crimes of game criticism.
Yeah, I mean, it's the thing where it's like, it makes sense for, like, how that happened, but when you look back at it now, it is like, no, seriously, like, Uncharted 3 really is just the best Uncharted game. Like, it's not just like I always was fighting for it, but, like, in the back of my head, I was like, yeah, I can see the argument for Uncharted 2. Playing through these games again, like, in this format, it is kind of hard for me to, like...
It's the culmination of what the other ones do well.
Yeah.
And we'll get there. We'll talk about each game individually. But, like, my thing I would say about Sully is Sully epitomizes to me what all these characters do well, which is he is both the best version of that surface archetype that I've ever seen. Just the performance by that actor, I think his name is Richard McGonigal or something like that.
I think that sounds right.
Richard McGonigal. I brought these up because I don't remember all the names of the actors, but they're all great. And he is so, so good. And some of the exchanges he and Nate have are fucking just hilarious, where like you have to put the controller down to laugh before you can move on with the game. My favorite one is in Uncharted 2, where it's like, I'm sweating like a hooker in church. You brought a hooker to church?
Yeah, that's great.
That's just a phenomenal one, because it's so out there on a limb, and yet clearly it's a shorthand language these two characters have with each other that is wonderful. So you have the best surface version of that archetype, and then beneath that, also the most human version of that, and in a way that drives these stories in a way that is just so interesting and compelling on so many levels. And I would say the same about Elena. She's the best surface version of that archetype, and more than that. Nate, best surface version of that archetype, and more than that. And they all drive these games in a way that is so phenomenal.
Yeah.
And the thing is, when we talk about it like this, we're just talking about the writing and the characters. These are, in fact, games. Yeah. And they work because they are, in fact, games. So let's talk about that.
Okay.
We'll just go I guess we can talk about it in a general sense what these do well as games. And I would say it's something they don't figure out in the first game and not quite in the second, and I think they do by the third.
Yeah.
But there is something about the pace of these games I love, where they can have those character moments. They can have that character and writing material sprinkled throughout, but there's also multiple kinds of things going on. There's platforming, there's puzzle solving, and there's shooting.
Yeah.
And I think two of those are more interesting than one of the others.
Right, yeah.
The shooting is always the least interesting part of these, but the interplay between all of that makes these feel varied and like you are part of the action in the world in a way that really enhances everything else. It's this constant symbiosis between the gameplay and the writing. and it's something they get better at over time and does culminate in something like The Last of Us.
Yeah.
But it is a fascinating process to see them do that, because even from Drake's Fortune, they are hitting at a higher level than most games do now, and that game is almost 10 years old.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it is something where it's like, you know, I recently had my little adventure with that new Tomb Raider game, which has its comparisons to Uncharted for a reason, but there are different games. But at the same time, like, you do see, like, those moments in that Tomb Raider game where it's like, they're doing the character stuff pretty well, like, and they do a good job at it, but it's like, if you are, like, making that direct comparison to Uncharted, it's like, there is that something, there is that balance that Uncharted has throughout, like, all three of those games that, like, even that Tomb Raider does pretty good at it, like, never quite achieve of, like, there's a attention to, like, balancing the action and the momentum of the story and the momentum of the gameplay and the pacing of those two things and keeping that in balance. That's like, just nobody else does that well.
No, like, you can have... my favorite parts of the Uncharted games are when you might have a solid hour or 2 hours where you're just platforming, you'll run into a puzzle. All the controls are so fluid for at least the platforming stuff. I wouldn't necessarily say it's for the shooting, but I feel like you just feel totally in control of the character. It's very rare where I think you run up against the controls, or at least it was for me.
Yeah.
And I just had so much fun doing that, and there will be character chatter in the background. You're just exploring these incredible environments that Naughty Dog has made. I really think I could make the argument graphically these are the most impressive games I've ever seen. And even though there are games that probably more modern, like The Witcher 3, that technically are operating at a higher level just because it's newer, there's something about the variety of environments on Uncharted I find so dense and visually just rich.
I mean, it's like the art design in those games is spectacular. And like the environment design is at the top of its game, like all throughout. And it's like, and then you like, again, like Last of Us feels like it is the peak of that in a lot of ways in terms of like so much sort of like density and detail in the environments, but at the same time that detail not feeling overwhelming the way it can in some modern games. Like they are able to build a life into their environments, even when their environments are like these incredibly implausible ancient tombs that are somehow have like super high technology, like gears and light beams and stuff. That's like there's a reality to it that they somehow managed to get across.
Absolutely, but you know, Drake's Fortune is a game from 2007. Obviously, it's a very important year in video gaming, but there's a lot of 2007 games you'll go back to and look nice, have great things about them visually, but I would not call them jaw-dropping.
Yeah, like Call of Duty 4's graphics have not aged spectacularly.
No, not at all. And I know I'm playing the Nathan Drake Collection remaster.
Yeah, so it does look
better,
yeah.
But it's still built on a certain foundation, and they're just consistently Drake's Fortune, and it just grows over the course of those games. I just would get into a new environment, particularly anything involving a jungle, because they do that the best.
Yeah.
With those temples, some of the indoor areas, and it's just literally my jaw would drop. I couldn't believe what I was seeing, and this is a game built on 10-year-old technology at this point, and in some ways hasn't aged a day, and in some ways looks better than a lot of games made now for current hardware.
Yeah, I think Uncharted 1 has aged a little bit rougher than like that one. Going back to it, like you can see some of the cracks, particularly the animation feels, in the cutscenes in particular, feels a little bit more almost sort of cartoonish. Like you can see in Uncharted 1 the DNA from Jack and Daxter a lot heavier than in like Uncharted 2 and Uncharted 3. I feel like they find a better medium between like, obviously, like, it's not going to be, like, super hyper-realistic, like, almost like it looks live action. It's never going to be that. So it needs to be slightly cartoonish. But there's an exaggeration to the animations of Uncharted 1 that's a little bit too far, that they dial back and find a better medium.
Absolutely, but when you're just, like, playing the game and running around a temple or something, it's like, oh my god, there are games now with lower texture detail on things than, like, the rocks in this tomb.
Yeah. Or their water tech has always been real good. Like, that was one of the real standout moments I remember when they were like at the E3 demos and stuff like that with Uncharted 1. And for all the games, like the wet clothing, like in like him like rolling through like a puddle or something, stepping through a puddle and is like splashing on his jeans. Like they've always managed to get that across really well. And that's like one of those like weird things that's like not the most important graphical detail in the world, and plenty of games are fine by not like incorporating an element like that. But like there's a level of detail to that, particularly Uncharted 1, that was super impressive in the day and still holds. God damn it! It still holds water now. I didn't mean to do that.
Okay.
I really didn't mean to do that. That's a bad pun. But it's like that, like the wet clothing and then like him drying off and like the clothing getting wet related to like it's not like he steps in the puddle and all of a sudden you switch to like wet Nathan Drake, who's like his character model that was in water. Like a lot of games handled that way, and just like fade the two character models together over time once you leave. Like, it's a lot more dynamic than that. And that, like, I feel like if you're talking about Uncharted 1, you have to talk about that because that was the thing at the time of that game.
And it still is really interesting.
Yeah.
So, and then I want to talk about the platforming stuff because I really love that.
Yeah, it's good.
I think it's so well built in. Like, that's comes from the Jak and Daxter DNA and the things Naughty Dog had done before, but adapting it to here and the way it evolves over the course of the 3 games, it's what grabbed me most from a gameplay standpoint in the first game, and it just gets better and better where it's not traditional platforming. It's not Mario or anything like that. It's not even, Ratchet and Clank or Jak and Daxter. It's something so much more just ingrained into the environment and what you're doing, where when you really think about it, you're not doing anything all that dynamic. You're climbing some rocks, the controls are not that complex, and yet it's just, you feel so in tune with that character because what you do is so fluid. It doesn't feel like Assassin's Creed where sometimes you really have to force the character to climb up that fucking building.
Yeah.
It just kind of works, and it's so intuitive where they very rarely have to tell you where to go. You're very rarely, I feel like, lost in the level design.
Yeah, they use their environmental clues very well.
It's just so intuitive and interesting. And, I saw a quote from Amy Hennig once, so she was the director on these games, and it was really interesting where she said, I don't like the term platforming for these. I feel like it's a new kind of thing we're trying, and it's like adventuring. You could call it that.
Yeah.
I think it's true. It feels like something that has never really been done before and really has never been done since. I don't know if you can point to someone who's really taken the Uncharted model and done it in any way successfully.
Yeah, like Tomb Raider has a bit of that, but it's very minor of like using your climbing axe to climb up little ledges, but it's not like a big part of that game the way it is Uncharted.
No, it's like I feel like they said, we can't do what Naughty Dog did. We'll do our own kind of thing with it.
Yeah.
But it's so well done and so ingrained. It does feel like a little unlike any game you've ever played. And then you mix in the puzzles that come in, which get, I think, dramatically better over the course of the 3 games.
Yeah, Uncharted 3 has the best puzzles by far.
Oh, yeah. I love the puzzles in Uncharted 3. But all of that feels so interesting. And a lot of character building in there, too, because the thing of pulling out Drake's journal is so interesting and I think they make better and better use of it, but it's a fun character building thing, and they take advantage of it so well. And then those shooting parts come in, and I think that's the worst paced part of the first 2 games. But even then, there's some where it's just like, yeah, you've got to do the platforming, you got to do the puzzle solving, but also sometimes Nathan Drake is a thief and an adventurer, damn it, and he's got to shoot a couple motherfuckers.
Yeah. And it is something where it's like, that is the part of the game where, particularly Uncharted 1, it was always like not that good. That is also the part of those games that has aged the worst, although like my opinion on the combat, like weirdly enough, has like actually improved upon my second playing because I think I'm better at the game now than I was the first time, and so there are things about the combat that I see now that I couldn't the first time I played through it. But there is like the one thing, even by Uncharted 3, they never quite nailed the cover mechanics. Like they never it's such a tricky thing, and so few games do it very well. Like Gears of War 3 is still the high bar for button-based cover mechanics in the game. That's like, when I play Gears of War 3, like, if I want to take cover behind a thing, I will take cover behind that thing, and I will not take cover behind the other side of that thing, or like the right side of it instead of right behind it. This Uncharted, like, they get better at it, and Uncharted 1 is definitely the worst, but there is a clunkiness to the cover mechanics that's like, you're never 100% sure when you're like walking up to this pillar and you're going to hit circle. It's like, I really want to take cover to, like, I am perpendicular to this pillar. I want to be there because all the other guys are on this other side of this pillar and I don't want to get shot. But there's a fairly significant chance that I will hit circle and he will glue to the right side of the pillar, and all of a sudden Nathan's just like standing there leaning against this pillar while he's getting bullets in the face. It's like, God damn it. Take cover behind the pillar, motherfucker.
Well, it's those moments that take you out of it in a way you don't want to be taken out of it.
It's one of the few things about the game that feels clunky still.
Yes.
It's like, and like I said, like most cover shooters don't ever get that down all the way, so it's like, that's not a heavy criticism, but of criticisms you can level at these games, particularly even still at Uncharted 3, that is like probably actually my most significant one.
Well, absolutely, and I think the bigger problem is that even if the shooting were really good, in this kind of game, the shooting is just never going to be the most interesting part.
Sure.
Frankly, unless you are Bungie making Halo or certain parts of Destiny, shooting is kind of a mindless thing. Yeah. And it's hard to make it in a way that is strategic and interesting on the same level of a platformer or an RPG or something like that. Shooting is the kind of game mechanic that can fall into the I just drool while looking at the screen the fastest.
Sure.
And I think in Uncharted, you don't want to make it too complex because it is a hero fantasy on some level. You
Yeah.
just want to be able to shoot and have fun. It's very arcadey in some ways, I think.
Yeah, definitely.
And that's fine. That's what it should be going for. But the problem to me is in the pace of Uncharted 1 and 2, there are sections where they really get way too in love with the shooting stuff, and you're doing it for what feels like hours on end. And it's like, no, this needs to be broken up more. And you really only notice how bad it gets in some parts of Uncharted 1 and 2 when you get to 3, and they're really good with the pace, and I don't feel like there's any part of Uncharted 3 where you're doing any one thing for too long, because that's the real magic of any game has multiple mechanics like this, is you want to be excited to get to the other mechanic every time you get to it.
Yes.
Like in Uncharted 3, every time a firefight started, I'm like, oh, cool, I haven't done this in a while, this will be fun. And then by the end of it, I'm like, okay, I have my fill of that. Oh, good, I get to go solve a puzzle now, or something. Like, nothing ever felt it was like bumping up against each other in an uncomfortable way. Whereas I think the most egregious thing in the whole Uncharted trilogy is the last third of Uncharted 2 is all shooting all the time.
The last third that's way too much.
Last quarter.
That's still too it's
like a long stretch where it feels like
it's like the very end of Uncharted 2 is the only time where I really feel that. Like, especially by the time they get into Shangri-La. And that's like a lot to do with like the blue guys is like
you have
bad.
Brief sections in the entire part. I mean, when you get back to the in medias res, you have some brief sections with some puzzles and climbing and stuff, but you also have an entire army you're fighting, and it got to me a little dull because there's just so much.
Like, the only part where I would like kind of agree with that is I think by the time you get to once you're out of the village, like I think all the stuff like you like get to the village, you go to the ice cave, you come back and fight with the tank there. All that stuff is great. It's like when you start heading up to the mountain or whatever where Shangri-La is, like that's where the fatigue eventually starts setting in that section. That's where it starts feeling a little bit more like Uncharted 1, where like Uncharted 1 has really long sections where it's like all you are doing is combat, and like it gets pretty tedious at some point. And Uncharted 2, I think, like manages that pretty well until like it stumbles at the end. But like Uncharted 3 definitely like has the best. Okay. I just wanted to I think you're overstating it with Uncharted 2, but we'll be more specific.
That's fine. It depends on where you define it, I guess. It's just I felt the fatigue in that part, particularly because up until that point, Uncharted 2 does a really good job managing it.
Sure, yeah.
But it's also like we're not even talking about the set pieces yet, which are a huge part of this game, which can involve platforming and shooting and all of that at the same time. Those get better as these games go along, but that's a whole other thing in these games that is this, they're just going to throw down and be like, we're going to show you something you've never seen in this medium.
Yeah.
And frankly, you think you've seen in a movie, but you really never have on this scale.
Not like this.
And those parts are incredible. And there's some good ones in Uncharted 1, some really great ones in Uncharted 2, and some really great ones in Uncharted 3.
Yeah. And that is the part with Uncharted 1 that I feel like they didn't quite find yet, is that like Uncharted 1 has some sort of set piecey moments, but nothing that like really stands out. Whereas like Uncharted 2 and Uncharted 3, like there are like some things I could say like falling building or tank or like jeeps or train. In Uncharted 3, it's like boat and fire mansion. It's like you having played this game or anyone listening to playing this game can think immediately to like, okay, yeah, that's that part of that game. Uncharted 1, like I played that game like a month ago, I guess, at this point. Like, that's still kind of hard to think, like...
No, Uncharted 1 is the weakest for a number of reasons, but that's definitely one of them. I mean, those set pieces become very integral.
Yeah.
I mean, we're going to talk about it more later, but the opening of Uncharted 2, part of why it is so amazing is it was Naughty Dog just throwing down the gauntlet and saying, we're doing something no one's ever even attempted in this medium before.
Yeah.
And we're going to do it better than anyone ever will in some ways, you know?
Yeah.
Just we're going to go crazy here. It's nuts. So let's talk about the individual games.
Okay.
There's Drake's Fortune, the first one.
Yes.
This game has kind of had an interesting critical arc. Obviously very well received at the time it came out.
Well, I wouldn't, well received, but I would say, in the video game parlance, an 8.5 out of 10 was more or less the average. Well received, but with flaws that need to be noted.
Right, and then I think 2 and 3 became the big ones of
those are the huge massive critical success.
Every Game of the Year award.
Yeah,
huge commercial successes also, all that, and yet. Even though Uncharted 1 does have more flaws probably than 2 and 3, I think it's a really good game, and I don't want to undersell how good it is.
Yeah, it's a very good game. It's not, it has, I don't think the critical reception at the time was accurate. It's a very good game that makes a very good foundation, but, there are some flaws in the pacing and the combat and stuff,
Absolutely.
and some sequences of the game that aren't particularly well designed that, Uncharted 2 improves upon massively.
But even playing it almost 9 years later,
Yeah.
2016, there are things that are just revelatory for me.
Yes, it's still, there are parts of it that hold up extraordinarily well.
Just seeing how you can do character in this context. And I've played The Last of Us. I know what the ultimate nth degree of this was, but seeing the inception of it here, that part of it hasn't aged a day. Like, it is just so fantastic on that level. Seeing those character relationships develop within that one game, feeling like how Nathan moves and how movement becomes the core of this game in such interesting ways, how it uses setting and multiple settings. There are so many things this game does so extraordinarily well. And it's interesting because 2007 is still, there has not been a more important year for games since.
Yeah,
it is, this landmark year, and it was a landmark year of a bunch of games that were in different ways flawed, but were foundations for bigger things. As some of them, like obviously Modern Warfare, you wouldn't say that about. Halo 3, you wouldn't say that about. But Mass Effect, Assassin's Creed, Uncharted.
Yeah,
I'm probably forgetting a few. As BioShock,
I think Mass Effect might have been 2008.
Mass Effect's 2007.
Are you sure?
Yeah,
it might be. Yeah, you're probably right. So I remember all this stuff.
No, it's okay, but. Yeah, it's a really interesting year because, they're obviously, this is better than like the first Assassin's Creed or something.
Oh God, yes, like the first Assassin's Creed is the poster child for like technically impressive but like terrible game.
Mass Effect was November 20th, 2007.
Okay.
Yeah. So late 2007.
Yes.
It was 2007. So I would say Mass Effect and Uncharted are on the better end. Like, if you have to rank those three, Mass Effect, I think, is the best of those, and then Uncharted maybe in the middle, and then Assassin's Creed is the bad game that became good, I guess, later on.
Good, then bad, then good, then bad, then okay.
Yeah.
Let's skip some steps in the middle, but just hit the most important ones.
It wins circles in the middle.
Yeah, definitely.
A little bit. But no, I just think that's such a... Someone's going to have to write a book on that year in games at some point, and it will be fascinating, because it's such a landmark year. But Uncharted, as with the best games from that year, the things that it did well, oh my God, they hold up.
Yeah. It's just like the characters and the writing, like in particular, and the pacing with the combat stuff is not amazing. That's the part that's like the most grating about that game to me. But even with that being sort of grating, it's mostly grating compared to the other Uncharted games. Whereas compared to a lot of third person action games, the pacing for the story stuff is actually really well done, because usually that stuff's terrible.
Is 2007 Gears of War also, or was that?
No, that's 2006. That's definitely 2006.
Okay, that's just
sure,
because I know Gears of War had kind of reinvented how we saw that whole genre.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons why I also think Uncharted 1 was more of an 8.5 game, is because it was obviously in development while Gears of War was in development, and Gears of War came out in 2006 and was like, holy shit, this is cover. Third-person cover shooter combat. That's what that is. And then Uncharted comes out a year later, it's it's okay, but it's the combat in this game is not fucking Gears of War.
I think you also have to give Drake's Fortune credit for creating the story structure that would be tried and true by the time we get to Uncharted 3.
Yes. Yeah.
I love these games, and it's a sign of how good they are that you kind of forget the story in every one is literally, we're looking for a lost city. We find the lost city. Supernatural shit happens. We get out of the lost city while it crumbles behind us, and then we fly away in a seaplane.
Technically, with Uncharted 1, it starts off with them thinking it's going to be a lost city of El Dorado, but it's actually it's not the city of gold, it's a man of gold, so it's a lost statue that's in a sort of lost city. So it's not exactly the same.
But, so they're doing, obviously, this cinematic story structure.
Yeah.
It's a search across... It's not a single environment game, which, of course, most games still, and should be. I mean, that's probably the best way to do it, whether it's an open world or something. You can stretch yourself too thin if you try to go to too many places.
Yeah.
That's never been a problem for Uncharted.
Although, Uncharted 1 is the one that, it's basically all on that island.
Right.
Uncharted 2 is the first one. That's one of, one of the improvements of Uncharted 2 that, makes it a really remarkable step up from Uncharted 1 is that you win all this that sort of globe hopping adventure in Uncharted 2. It's that little red dotted line on the map going around.
Yeah.
Uncharted 1 is you've got a little bit of stuff beforehand, and then it's you get to that island and you are on that island, motherfucker.
But if the idea behind Drake's Fortune is we're going to bring cinematic aesthetics into video games and expand upon it within this video game medium, it does that very, very successfully, even if certain parts of that formula are not yet there, the big set pieces. A little bit, but not fully formed. They're still in kind of the nascent stages.
Yeah, but all the character stuff, and the character stuff with these Naughty Dog games does not just mean the cutscenes, but it's walking around, the platforming, and even parts of the combat all feel like they are built into parts of the story, parts of the character, and like there's dialogue that happens that's important and funny and interesting, like all throughout that section that builds on the characters. And that's one of those things about Uncharted 1 that still holds up really well, is that like you feel like you are playing as Nathan Drake, and like you are Nathan Drake in this scenario, in this ridiculous plot that you found yourself in, and in these ridiculous scenarios that you need to get yourself out of. And it's that ability to build that character and allow the player to invest themselves in that character and like want to kind of play as Nathan Drake and have fun in this world. That's what Uncharted 1 like nails, like right off the bat. That still feels like has not aged today.
Right. And then throughout, I think there are some ways they don't mix things up enough all the time, but there's some really fun moments. Like I love that part where you get in the little speedboats and you do that thing.
Yeah, I never loved the speedboat.
I don't necessarily think it controls great,
Yeah.
but there's something about where it comes, and I think you're with Elena for that whole part, right?
Yeah, because that's the best part about the speedboat thing, is the first time she is just on the back of your speedboat shooting a fucking grenade launcher the whole time, and that's really cool.
And I just like where that goes on a character, since you're in a new area of the island at that point.
Sure, yeah.
And it just feels like, and visually it's very cool. So again, not my favorite thing to play, but it's a moment that I just remember as being kind of a standout in the progression of that game. Even though, of course, if you compare it to, as you say, like Flaming Mansion or something, it's not the best set piece. But
it is a nice little like break. Like there's a little bit of pacing there, but like kind of remembered it the first time I played the game, and then like playing it again, I got to those sections like, oh right, the jet ski sections, I like these are in this game, and it's like, and there's like, it's two really short sections, it's not a big deal, but it is like the control is just really stiff on that jet ski in a way that feels awkward and like not polished, not up to like the Naughty Dog standard where it's like moving Nathan Drake and stuff like that feels really good all the time in all these games. It's like some of the combat side of it is a little bit floaty in Uncharted 1, but it's generally very well done, and the jet ski just feels like, this doesn't feel like I'm controlling a jet ski. Like, this just feels like I'm controlling a water tank, and it's just weird.
Right. So I guess the last thing I would say on Uncharted 1 is just that, you know, I had known the narrative for a long time was Uncharted 1 is good, not great, then they get awesome.
Yeah.
And I totally understand that, and I wouldn't necessarily disagree with it, but I did not fall in love with Uncharted 2. I fell in love with it 5 minutes into an Uncharted 1, and that love kept up through that game, even if I think there are rough patches. And then it really took off in Uncharted 2 and 3. But I really, I got 10 minutes into Uncharted 1, and I'm like, yep, where have you been all my life? This is for me.
Yeah, for me, the first time and I just want to, before we get any further, while I remember it, just call back to 2 years ago or whatever, whenever, the first time I talked about Uncharted, you go back and listen to that podcast. I said fucking then, like, Jonathan, you should play these games. You would goddamn love them. And you waited years to finally get to it, because it was like, these are like Indiana Jones, but even more awesome because they're great games, and you love Indiana Jones way more than I do. It took you fucking forever to play these fucking games.
I know.
It's like, of course you fell in love with Uncharted immediately, because the first time I played it, like, I definitely wouldn't say I suffered through Uncharted 1, but like, I found Uncharted 1 a very uneven experience, and I liked it, but by the time I got to Uncharted 2, I was very eager to get to the next game that improved a lot of the faults. But I will say, like, and this is like for all three of these games, replaying them, my opinion of them has increased pretty measurably. I love them a lot more now. And like, so it's like, but part of that is with Uncharted 1 that like, it's so fascinating to go back to Uncharted 1 and see what they did. I think like, this will come up more often, like playing these games with 60 frames per second and a DualShock 4 instead of 30 frames per second and a DualShock 3. That is a improvement that cannot be fucking understated.
Can you really blame me for waiting for the PS4 version?
Yeah, I mean, you never knew that was going to happen when I said that.
No,
so.
you didn't. I didn't.
Yeah.
Also, and I don't hate the
And
PS3
you're like, I didn't even own a goddamn PS3, and somehow I played those games and you didn't.
Yeah, you know.
How the fuck did that even happen?
I don't know.
But anyways, yeah, but like, yeah, so like, I think my original opinion on Uncharted 1 is valid. Like, I wouldn't like say it's like I was wrong feeling that way then, but like, I think it's a better game, honestly, like upon replay. That like there are things about that game, especially when you know the characters better, and you know that world and that setting better. You like have fallen in love with them, even if you found the first experience rough. Like going back to that game and seeing those things that like now with your new perspective on these characters that like you couldn't see the first time. Like even if you didn't love Uncharted 1 the first time, I think it's really worth a replay, because I wasn't planning on replaying it all the way through, and I just sort of. It sucked me back in terms of like the characters in the world. I was like, fuck it. Like, it's not that long a game. I'll just play through it again.
And I think if you're listening to this and you've never played Uncharted, have the right expectations with Uncharted 1. Know that it is the imperfect first chapter. Know that it was made in 2007 when cover-based shooting like that was very new. I mean, that was a thing we were figuring out. And just know that where the strengths are very strong, and where the strengths aren't, don't be looking for that. And that's I think you'll be fine. I think part of it was I had the right expectations going to 1 is that I wasn't expecting like the greatest third-person shooter ever.
Right, yeah.
Which is not what this is at all. And where I was looking for the strengths, they were there stronger than I had even hoped to imagine. And it sucked me in. And then you get to Uncharted 2, and Nathan is in a train.
Yeah. And
that train is hanging off a cliff, and Nathan's been shot.
And he's bleeding, and he's bleeding bad.
Uncharted 2, where, again, we're in 2009, which is the year of fucking amazing like video game openings. I think, is Mass Effect 2 2009 or 2010?
Yeah, it's 2009 or 10.
Okay.
We don't need to look
that era. But, you know, there are a lot of great video game openings in this period to the sequels of 2007 games.
Yeah.
And Uncharted 2, you could say it's the best if you wanted to. It's another one where I'd have to think about it. But if you said, that's my favorite video game opening ever, I'd be like, good choice. That's a great opening.
It's like, and especially like, and that's the thing that's the funniest to me when like I went back to Uncharted 1, because I had completely forgotten how Uncharted 1 had opened. And like, I can remember like vividly the openings for Uncharted 2 and Uncharted 3 because they're so good and they're paced so well. And like, Uncharted 1 just has this really like, it just fucking starts and it's like, they open up this casket, and it's like, hey, it's like the casket of Francis Drake, and here's this map, and it's like, oh, pirates, bam, 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 bam. It's like, it feels like the most video game opening ever of like, it's just like, something has happened, you know these two characters' names, and now you're shooting someone, and it's like, you could have probably paced this a little bit better, and then you get to Uncharted 2, and that's where it's like, you get like some nice music, like the opening quote with like Marco Polo happens, and then you just like Nate like falls down and like hits the thing and grabs this rail and he's bleeding and you're in like these like the Himalayas, the mountains, and it's snowy and you're like, wait, what's happening? And then you like the camera pulls out and you're like hanging off this fucking train that's dangling off this cliffside that then you like have to slowly climb up while like Nate's kind of like talking to himself.
It is a great opening on so many different levels.
Yeah.
I mean, just completely divorced from all context. It is such a good sequence of, like, just the little platforming of getting up there. It stealthily tutorializes you for the rest of the game.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny because Nolan North is doing some good, what sounds like improv may or may not be throughout that sequence.
Actually, that's something like I should mention, because I don't think they did this for Uncharted 1, but they definitely started with 2, because I saw a video that I think is on Eurogamer, that's an interview with Nolan North, where he talks about this. That's something that's like, every fucking video game should do this, that has these kinds of characters, is that apparently with what Naughty Dog does, and again, like this definitely is Uncharted 2 on, it might be on Uncharted 1, is they will sit the voice actors down with like a developer who will play through a sequence of the game that's like, this is a sequence with Nathan and Chloe, and they're like in the city, and they will play through that sequence, and Nolan North and like the voice actors for Chloe will be there watching them play it with microphones and improv dialogue for like the scenarios that are happening as the developer plays the game, and they will take the best bits of that and put it in.
That's brilliant.
Yeah, and that's why there's a couple of, I remember like from watching that interview, there was a couple of scenes that Nolan North talked about specifically that's like on Uncharted 2, when you get to the top of the hotel and there's a pool at the top of the hotel when you're with Chloe, you can jump in the pool and he says, Marco, come on, Marco, and like Chloe doesn't want to go along with it. There's like, that's one of those scenes.
So they're like riffing on the game while playing it.
Yeah, and then in Uncharted 3, there's a scene that's like, and this was a line I didn't even really notice the first time I played it, but since I'd seen this interview and then played Uncharted 3, I fucking lost my shit because I forgot about it. When you're in the mansion before everything goes to shit, like you're just exploring it, and I think you kind of like fall down into this hallway, and then like you're like the camera is sort of like naturally situated in such a way that you see this weird like red object that's like this big like sort of like rectangular thing standing there, and it just goes, is that a popcorn machine? And it's like, it's this one little line that like, again, you wouldn't really take notice of it. And Nolan North said in the interview that's like, yeah, I said it because I didn't know what that thing was, and I still don't know what that thing was. It's just something that like an environment artist put in there. And so he has that line, and then in Uncharted 3, if you go into Nate's notebook and you like go find, there's like one page from like in the mansion area that you can find that has a bunch of sketches of those things with like an arrow pointing to them and a question mark is like WTF. It's a fucking amazing. Like that's
that's so clever.
Like that's and that makes a lot of stuff that then in Last of Us makes a lot more sense of like how do you find these really natural dialogue moments that feel improv? It's because they have these actors actually improv those lines. And it's like, so I would not be surprised in the slightest if a lot of that stuff from the beginning of Uncharted 2 with Nate climbing up the train was improv by Nolan North. Or it might have been scripted, or it's probably a mixture of both of them. But like, that's the kind of shit that when we talk about like how Naughty Dog is at the top of the business in terms of like incorporating game like characters and gameplay and stuff, like that's the kind of stuff we talk about.
It's so creative because there's zero risk to an approach like that. If the improv doesn't work, that's fine. You go write something and make it better. Your cost is the actor's time and a couple mics while the developer plays it. You know, that's really clever.
Yeah,
that's
and
awesome.
that's why it feels like when you're playing those games, you're constantly getting little character bits because it's like you are, even when like Nate's on his own, he's talking to himself and stuff, and it's like it feels very natural because it is like natural dialogue.
Absolutely. So getting back to the greatness of this opening.
Yeah.
So again, out of context, it's a fun sequence to play. It's very breathtaking visually. I mean, again, this is now 6 years past the release of this game.
Yeah.
That part hasn't aged a day.
Yeah, it's still great.
Stunning. It's like you're playing. It's like I've never seen anything like this. But then in context, this is the start of the game, and it tells you so much about what this game will be about, which is Nate going way the hell in over his head and getting to places where he's really never been before and is not equipped to go.
Yeah,
and shit's going to hit the fan. And then I think also this being kind of it's not quite the midpoint of the game. I think it's a little more than halfway when you get to the train stuff.
Yeah, probably.
But you know, when you get to that point and that it's this thing that you're constantly building to, like, okay, at some point, Nate's going to hit a train and things are not going to go well when he gets there.
Yeah.
And it's constantly threatening. Everything's threatening to go to shit. And as you say, with, like, the Harry character and Chloe being a good person, but someone who represents kind of the most reckless side of Nathan Drake, things are going to go south. And because you've already seen that first sequence, you very explicitly know that.
Yeah, and it does really makes it when you get to the part where, like, Lazarevich is on a train, and then like you're like with Elena, it'll like you're like, okay, Elena, like drive me up, like I'm gonna get on this train, and you get to that sequence, you're just like, don't get on the train, you fucking dumbass. I know how this shit goes, and it's such a brilliant little like narrative device that opening, because it's like it does so much for setting your expectations, setting the tone. But like in setting the expectations for the tone in terms of where it's going to go, not where it starts. So it creates a sense of like drama from the get-go, while also tutorializing you on a little bit of the shooting stuff, but mostly like on how all the platforming stuff works. It teaches you how to look for all the environmental cues, because Uncharted 2, for the most part, uses a lot of like yellow in the environment to cue you as to how you navigate the platforming sections. And that's like feels very natural with the train, so it trains you immediately to look for all that. Trains you immediately to look for all that stuff.
You're on fire tonight, Sean.
It's Pun City over here. I don't know what happened. But yeah, it does all of that. It like sets up the stakes for the character, and then it ends with that whole sequence ends with like once you get up and all that stuff, you pick up the dagger. That's like the key to all that stuff that then like sets up the primary narrative device before you actually get to it. It's like all of that stuff, like it's such a brilliant opening when compared to Uncharted 1, which again, like, which is not to diss Uncharted 1, is to diss like video game openings in general, because most of them are that like you put in the game, you start it up, and then like it's just like I'm Nathan Drake, I'm Elena, this is a setup for the plot, bam 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 bam, and it's like that's how video games start, because they want to get you playing the game immediately. Uncharted 2 finds a way to get you to play the game like actually faster than Uncharted 1 does, and like set up all the stuff you need to do narratively to pace the game well. Like that's fucking brilliant.
And again, just something in the water in this generation between that and Mass Effect 2.
Yeah, Mass Effect 2 also just brilliant.
Does Red Dead Redemption have a great opening? I forget.
Oh, it has it's the whole sequence when you like come in on the train. It's like it's not amazing, but it's a very good opening.
I just remember it atmospherically setting the tone. I'm just trying to think of games from that era that I found really breathtaking in how they treated stuff. But yeah, I mean, it was a good time. Interesting generation. So, so overall, Sean, we talked about the opening. What makes Uncharted 2 Among Thieves such a historically great game?
Like, I think it's a lot of stuff. Like, it's in general, it has, like, it's all the ways that it improves upon Uncharted 1 is just feels very remarkable. But I think it gets, honestly, like, the number one thing to me is it's both, like, that pacing for the story and all that stuff, but it's also just that sense of, like, the scope of the story. It's that, like, as I talked about a little bit before, like, the globe-trotting nature of it, of you going to all these locations and, like, having all these big set-piece moments. And it's, like, that sense of, like, especially for, like, the whole, like, first half, maybe even up to, like, 3/4 of the game, like, that whole second is, like, the pacing is just absolutely perfect. That's, like... And like I said, it does, and it never feels like, for being a story-heavy game, it never feels like Metal Gear or something where it's like you hit this section where you're watching an hour-long cutscene, like the end of Metal Gear Solid 2 or something. It's like, there are all the cutscenes in the game, like, top out at 5 minutes. It's like the maximum length a single cutscene ever gets. And it's like, you can look, that like, they let you watch all the cutscenes, because that's another thing about the Uncharted games, is there's a lot of great ease-of-life features they put in, of, like, being able to put on subtitles in the middle of a cutscene, and pause cutscenes and stuff like that are great. But it is like, that game is just paced perfectly, except for the very end. Like there's a lot of stuff with Uncharted 2 that's like, this stuff is amazing, except for the very end. Like, that's, like, it is a little asterisk mark, and it's like, the game is still great. I think it's amazing. It's one of the best games I've played.
And it's not like the end is horrible. There's some good stuff in there.
Yeah, and actually, and again, like, as with everything with Uncharted 2, or with all these Uncharted games, like everything about the game, in my opinion, it, like, has improved, in my opinion, on my second playthrough. That it's like, even though, like, you know, I don't think, like, the very, very end with all, like, the blue guys and stuff in Uncharted 2 is not great, but it's also, it's not that long. You actually only fight the blue guys 3 times total. It's like, in my memory, there was, like, a lot longer section, and when you actually get into it, it's like, no, like, that's, like, yeah, they suck. They're, like, bullet spongy enemies. It's not good, but, like, it's a very quick little bit. And so, yeah, like, Uncharted 2 is just, it's paced to perfection, and the way, as we all, like, we don't need to go in depth with, like, the character stuff, because I think we really talked about that, but, like, it does do that with, like, you're setting up your expectations with, like, to be like, oh, this is that sort of Indiana Jones thing of, like, every story is kind of standalone story, and then it's like, no, actually, it's, like, continuing all this stuff, and it's doing that on purpose. Like, it's setting these things up, and the game's, like, it's clever.
Confidence and audacity. That is Uncharted 2 to me, which is that they are audacious to a degree that makes everyone at Naughty Dog seem like they are insane people.
Yeah.
Like, just think about the number of steps in the overall train set piece.
Right.
Which is that you have the journey up to the train, which is this giant kind of combat sequence. Then there's to get on the train, which is this incredible thing where you're in the car and you have to jump onto the wheel and all that stuff. No, that's a plane. That's later.
That's Uncharted 3.
That's an Uncharted 3.
Yes.
I'm still remembering there's a whole build-up to the train that's really cool, right?
There is, yeah. Like, because you get in, like, you have to drive up. Because actually, now that I think about it, it's very similar to the plane section, because, like, Elena has to drive up in a Jeep, and you have to fight off all these guys, and then Elena drives up again, and you, like, hop in and, like, jump onto the train.
Anyway, so you get on the train. Then there's the whole part where the train is going through the jungle.
Yeah, and then you're, like, running on the train and fighting dudes and stuff.
Yeah,
that's good.
Then there's the part where the train is in the ice. Then the train fucking blows this fuck up.
You fight a helicopter on the train.
Oh, right.
That fucking happens, too.
Yes. You do that, the train falls off. There's the back to the in medias res opening where you go back up.
Yeah.
More stuff happens. Like, it is insane to ever attempt something like that in a movie, in a game, anything like that. But then the confidence that they can pull it off, and that no part of that is a misstep. It is just kind of rock solid perfect from note one to the end. That entire set piece. That's only one of the set pieces.
Yeah.
That's the biggest one. But you also think of that entire part where you're in that one Middle Eastern city and running through, and the buildings fall down, and there's a ton of stuff around the building fall down set piece.
Yeah.
That's just one part of it. But that's amazing. Some of the stuff near the end, just like that we're going to change environments completely and have ice caverns now.
Yeah.
Nuts.
And it's like, and that ice cavern sequence is one of the most gorgeous looking bits of any game I've ever played. Like, the what they managed to do with the lighting there, and, like, how they, like, designed the ice. Like, that's one of those where it's like, I've seen, like, way more technically impressive games, but, like, the art design here, and, like, how they use the tech that they have with the lighting and everything, like, does, like, it's incredible. And, like, watching it, like, looking at it when it's, like, up-res and everything, it's like, that part of the game looks really good.
They drive a tank through the town and make you fight it, and don't make it feel forced.
Nope, yeah, and then you, like, have to jump from Jeep to Jeep fighting guys.
Oh, God, that whole part, I forgot if that was in 2. There's something like that in 3 also.
In 3, they do, like, the Last Crusade nod, where you're, like, on the horse fighting that, like, taking out the
It's all just incredible, though. And again, it is audacious every step of the way, just like Nathan Drake is, frankly.
Yeah.
But it's also very confident in that execution. There's no part where it feels like they're reaching too far. Like, whatever sins Uncharted 2 has, which are fairly minor, they're not of ambition. Like, where they reach, they grasp. And it's really impressive every step of the way.
Yeah, and there's like... And then also, like, to talk about the combat stuff. Like, I think Uncharted 2 has some, like, pretty significant improvements over Uncharted 1 in terms of combat. Which is, like, although when you could, like... When the first time I played the games, I felt like Uncharted 2 was a huge step up in the combat compared to Uncharted 1. And Uncharted 3 was a more minor step up. But then on replay, and I think this is a lot because of the frame rate and the controller... Uncharted 1 and Uncharted 2's combat plays a lot more similarly to me. It's like Uncharted 3 is the one that feels like, oh, this is, like, the really big step up. But Uncharted 2, like, there is a lot of stuff in terms of... Like, some of the animation stuff, the cover stuff is much better. Like, it's still not perfect, but Uncharted 1, like, the cover stuff is really rough, I feel. But Uncharted 2, like, the sound design's a lot better. It's like Uncharted 1's sound design, like, the guns sound very sort of, like, wimpy, almost like there's not a lot of punch to them. Uncharted 2 gets a lot better at that. Uncharted 3 is the one that makes the huge improvement there. But it's like incorporating the melee stuff. The melee stuff is not nearly as stiff as it was in Uncharted 1. That feels a lot better. Grenades feel like you have a lot more control over how you throw the grenades. Like and then moving from cover to cover was not even a thing in Uncharted 1. It was just like I have to unstick from cover, run over to cover, and go back in. And Uncharted 2 has like you can like transfer from cover to cover with a button press. Like all that stuff are very necessary, much needed improvements over the way Uncharted 1 handled it.
Yeah, I definitely agree with all of that. I felt it was just playing it the first time in the Nathan Drake collection, I thought they were pretty minor overall, and then 3 felt like the big leap to me. But definitely it is better, and just the level design around the shooting is better. There's some really impressive sequences where the shooting is fun because of the arenas they've come up with and the areas you're in, and that matters a lot too, obviously.
Yeah, definitely.
So, Uncharted 2... fantastic. Can't overstate how good the beginning is, but also the ending. The last scene with Nathan and Elena. And they just kind of let that moment play and play and play, and then it fades out, and you sense it's still playing after the fade out. Just beautiful. Just perfect.
And fucking hilarious.
Hilarious.
That dialogue is great. Like, I don't know if it's scripted or if it's improv. Like, if it is scripted, it feels improv between the two actors. But it's like... It's just that, like, it is, like, this really great bit of her, just, like, on a scale of 1 to 10, like, how scared were you that I was going to die? And, like, and just, like, where that bit goes is incredible. Like, it's hilarious. It fits so much with both of those characters. I love Sully gets a great little moment at the end of the game where, like, he asks where Chloe is and, like, runs off. It's like, dirty old man. It's like, that's... Like, that was actually the number one disappointment for me replaying Uncharted 2. Overall, I like the game much more. But there's not enough Sully.
No, he drops out in the second half in a way that feels a little like they didn't know how to have both Elena and Sully in there at the same time.
Yeah, and Chloe, balancing all those characters at the same time felt like it was going to be too much for them.
Which, by the time of Uncharted 3, fuck it, they'll juggle everyone at once.
Yeah.
It's great. But yeah, it disappointed me a little too because I'm like, I want more Sully.
Yeah, because he's really great.
Yeah.
But then, like, because I keep on saying that, like, I like these games a lot better on my second playthrough, but, like, to just, like, go a little more in depth about why I think that way, and it's not just the frame rate and the controller stuff, but it is, like, specifically with the combat. The first time I played Uncharted 2, very specifically, like, a lot of the set-piece sequences I enjoyed a lot, like the train and the tank and the Jeeps in particular, because those are the more combat-heavy set-piece sequences in the game. Like, I enjoyed them, but there was a part of it that, like, was a little bit frustrating because every time you die in those sequences, it, like, sort of knocks the wind out of it a little bit, and, like, that can get a little bit annoying. And so there's something about the games stand up to replay really well in a way that most other very story-focused games don't, and that's because replaying the game, I know what the set pieces are. I basically know what to expect, and I know how to play the game. So I'm a lot better at it the second time coming through. So, like, one of the reasons why I was able to play through these games so quickly again on replay was because I died way less this time, and those sequences, particularly the tank scene with the tank being in the village, moving into you jumping from truck to truck, like, I think I died once in that whole extended stretch because I basically knew what to do and where to go, and, like, playing those games and being able to play them well to that extent, like, those sequences are fucking, like, it's totally different. It's 100% different when you are when you know what you're doing and you can play the combat like a little less sort of cautiously, and I can be a lot more like just run out there, fucking blind fire from cover to cover, like just like shoot dudes like running up, not even really aiming, like mix more of the melee stuff in, and like because the first time I played it, the games don't do a very good job at encouraging you to take a lot of risks in the combat because your health regen is pretty slow and you have to wait a long time for the health regeneration to really kick in. And so like there's that stuff that's like it feels like the first time you play it, you really want to stay kind of back, get behind cover, stay behind cover, pop up, shoot a dude, pop back down, that kind of stuff. And it's a valid way to play the game, and that's how I played it the first time. But on the second time, I kind of consciously was like, I'm just gonna play it a little bit more loose and like kind of like go for it more. And like the combat sings a lot better when you play it that way. And I wish the games, and I think Uncharted 4, just based on some of the stuff with the beta with like the grappling hook that I played with, hopefully that will do a lot better at designing the combat in such a way to encourage the player to play the way like you feel like the action scene is supposed to go. Because the action scene is supposed to be like the platforming of Nate jumping out there and like scraping by the skin of his teeth and like jumping on like stepping onto a thing that's about to fall apart. It's like he jumps out of the way and like shoots a guy and then runs over, gets behind cover, like grabs a dude and like throws him over and like knocks him out and chucks a grenade over and like runs away. Like that's, and playing those games again, that's how I kind of played the combat because I knew how it went. I didn't have a lot of fear of dying that much. And it's like, if you can do that, like those combat sequences are really, really fun when you play that way, particularly like that take sequence when you are just like constantly running. You never stop. Like you are getting behind cover for a second to reload and going over and like going on the zip line and taking a dude out, grabbing his rocket launcher, shooting the tank, running around, like getting on the next zip line, jumping off and like hitting a dude while you get off and all that stuff. And you finally beat the tank at the end without dying once. That is one of the most exhilarating things I've done in the game.
And see, this is why I felt like, and I'm sure you're right, but I felt like there was more combat than there probably is in the last half of Uncharted 2 because I died a lot.
Yes, and I know you died a lot because the Nathan Drake collection includes a feature where you can look at statistics and compare it to people in your friends list. So I know just how many hundreds of times you died while playing all the Uncharted games. And I know just how many more headshots I got than you.
This is humiliating.
Yeah. Actually, the funny thing is my gameplay, my combat style in the games became so reckless at some point that you have like 100 more headshots than me in Uncharted 3, whereas like I have more than you in all the other ones, and you could just see like my hit percentage and stuff go down in the statistics to where like by the time it's Uncharted 3, it's like 18% or something. It's like, and it's like I somehow like, because you obviously like if you die more, it means you're killing more guys and you're playing more. It's like, and I'm not trying to make fun of you for playing.
No, it's okay.
This is your first time playing. Like, of course I'm going to be better than you, and so. So you like played the game longer than me and like died more than me, but somehow in Uncharted 3, even with you having like total like 100 or with like 1 hour more total play time through like more times you died, I still fired more bullets than you did in that game. Like that's like one of the little things about the Nathan Drake collection that's like. That's a lot of fun because they track a lot of stats and it's fun to like.
I gotta look this up. I didn't even know that.
Yeah,
that's cool.
It's funny.
Well, anyway, what I was going to say is that both Uncharted 1 and 2, my biggest complaint would be the shooting. And one thing that happened to me in both games is in the kind of long marathon of shooting at the end of both of those, I got to a point where I found it hard, but not in a fun way, where like I just wasn't that invested in the shooting. Like it wasn't something that I even like. I could have gotten good at it and done fine, but I just got to a point where I just wanted to get through and play the set pieces and stuff.
Yeah.
And both games I wound up turning down to easy in like the last hour because I was just like, I just need to finish this. And I will say, I never had even a temptation to do that in Uncharted 3. And I think 3 has so many improvements to the combat. I even thought about turning it up to hard. Like, it was so fun the way it was. Like, you talk about all the ways you would just, like, I'm going to shoot this guy and then throw this guy over the ledge and then throw a grenade. Uncharted 3, one of the improvements I think is so important is that they finally figured out what they wanted to do with the melee stuff.
Yes, absolutely.
That's the biggest improvement. But also, like, the guns, I feel like there are probably more of them, but they feel like there's less and they feel like more distinct. And then how you use grenades and all that. It feels like you are actively encouraged to use all three in a mixture, whereas really you can just shoot in 1 and 2 and be fine.
Yeah.
You know, so I think that's one of the big improvements. So let's talk about Uncharted 3.
Yeah.
It would be short to just say, Sean, is there a single area where Uncharted 3 does not improve over 1 and 2?
No, I don't think so. Yeah.
I think it's everything. And it's not to put down 1 or 2, but down to, I mean, the music. Greg Edmondson's scores for 1 and 2 are fantastic.
Yeah.
For 3, it's just sublime. Like, I bought that soundtrack today so I could use the theme music here, because I try to legally purchase the music we use if I'm stealing it for our show.
Sure.
And I also wanted to listen to the soundtrack, and I was listening to it on the way over here, and I didn't want to stop. I got to your house, and I'm like, shit, I can't listen to the soundtrack anymore. It's really good.
Yeah.
And I just think all throughout Uncharted 3, it is so inspired. The writing is so inspired. The visuals are just unbelievable. Like, I can't believe this was made for the PS3.
Yeah.
Like, The Last of Us is obviously a very visually impressive game, and I played both the PS3 version and the PS4 version of The Last of Us, and there are scenes in Uncharted 3 that eclipse anything in that game in some ways, just because Last of Us is a different kind of environment.
Yeah, the scale is totally different. With like Uncharted 3, you're like going into those like insane tombs and stuff like that, the mansions burning down around you.
But I'm just saying, it's kind of funny, because Uncharted 3 was a full 2 years earlier than Last of Us. Last of Us was the last major game for the PS3, so it's crazy. As we said, the characters, the action, the combat, the pace, just everything is such a huge improvement, and I find it just so phenomenal.
Yeah, I mean...
And surprising in some ways, too, because even if Uncharted 2 has some weak spots, you kind of think, well, is there anywhere to go up from here? They did such a good job, even with those little flaws. It's like, what could be better than that train sequence?
Yeah.
Well, they're going to answer that question for you.
There are a couple things that can be, yeah. Yeah, like we talked a lot about the opening to Uncharted 2, and I think like because of its relationship to Uncharted 1 and stuff, the opening to Uncharted 2 is a little bit more impressive through like juxtaposition. But and it also like it's like the scale of it's so much bigger. But the opening to Uncharted 3, which is like much sort of like feels like a much more extended opening, like because it sort of like starts with the bar fight and stuff, and then like I feel like all the stuff that's the flashback stuff is also the opening to the game to me. Like there's something so intimate about the opening of Uncharted 3 that also like sets the tone for how that game is going to deal with its characters of like a lot of the little tiny issues that they've been hinting at here and there in the first two games. They're going to like really kind of dig into and explore more with Uncharted 3.
Oh, I think the Uncharted 3 opening, it's very different than Uncharted 2. I found it every bit as attention-grabbing, if not more, because it starts right off the bat with the Sully-Nate interplay. Yeah.
And I like how they somehow find a way to basically stick the opening to Temple of Doom and this opening to Last Crusade in the same opening.
They
like,
did figure it out.
It's this like fight in this nightclub over a deal gone wrong that turns into a flashback of young Indiana Jones / young Nathan Drake dealing with like sort of like becoming the person that you like, or starting on the steps to becoming the person that you know they're going to be related to a father figure. Like, it's just really funny how like again like they wear their influences on their sleeve, but like they do it so well that's like. Yeah, that opening is great.
The whole game is great. Uncharted 3 was an experience of every step of the way I'm thinking, this is getting better and better, and it is perfect. This is what Uncharted could always be. This feels like the potential fully realized, and I kept hoping, don't fuck it up. This is so good. And it never did. It just kept getting, I don't know if I would say it kept getting better and better, but at no point did it fall off or become any less interesting.
Yeah, there's no like weird bullet sponge enemy at the end of the game the way there is with Uncharted 1.
No, it feels like every mistake they could have made, they avoid so clearly.
Yeah.
They're introducing new interesting things right up to the end. Like there's that whole, you're wandering through the desert and having dreams and stuff.
Yeah.
That feels like something out of a Rocksteady Batman game in some ways, where they're just playing with the whole medium of video games. It's fantastic and fascinating, and it's the best of the lost cities that blow up and you have to run away from. It's also good. You know, there's just so many things the game does well. I almost forget about the entire middle part where you've got Chloe and Cutter, and you're going to the different countries together.
Yeah.
And yet that's a great part of the game, and that's all before Elena comes in. And I tend to remember the stuff in Yemen with Elena, but that first half of the game is tremendous.
Yes, yeah. I mean, and I think we should talk a little bit about like that flashback sequence at the beginning, because to me, like, you know, the bar fight is like really cool and it sets up the opening of the game, like how Nate and Sully get shot and like that's where the flashback triggers. Like all that stuff's great, but like the real meat of that opening is it then like flashing back to Nate's like 12 years old or something, and you see his sort of first adventure where he's trying to steal the ring that Francis Drake's ring with like from small. The great beginnings, there's greatness from small things, or whatever the fuck it says in Latin. And like that whole sequence where, like we've talked about before, Uncharted knows how to sort of breathe in sections and knows how to pace, and that, like, you know, you're walking through the museum, you're sort of like looking at all these weird little artifacts, you get a look at Nate's little notebook and stuff when he's clearly a lot younger, so he's nowhere near good at drawing and all that. And you're just walking through that section, and then slowly things start escalating. Sully gets in, you pickpocket Sully. Sully then becomes a more major character, and you're trying to run away from him. There's a whole awesome rooftop sequence where you're running away from all these guys, and then you get it ends with that conversation between Nate and Sully in the diner where they basically decide to team up and become buddies. It's that whole sequence is so awesome, and there's so much meat to it, and it feels like it shows you something that you didn't even really expect or want to see, or you didn't think you wanted to see, but they make it so necessary for those characters.
This is the kind of scene I normally hate.
Right.
I will confess, I don't really like the opening to Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade.
Yeah, it's not amazing, but
I think it's okay. It's okay.
It's not as good as the rest of that movie.
River Phoenix is really good. I have nothing against him.
Yeah.
It's that armchair psychology of everything that defines a character happens to him on one day of his young life.
Sure, yeah.
And I don't like that. It's a type of storytelling crutch I've never been a fan of. And what I love about the Uncharted 3 version of it is that they tell you almost nothing about Nathan Drake. They tell you nothing about his past. They tell you very little about how he got here, why he's doing this, and is all implied and shown through action. It is the definition of showing over telling.
Yes.
And you get so much about Nathan Drake with what is really so little. Not that it's a short sequence, it's a fairly meaty chunk of the game, but all of that feels like through his actions and through things that are happening in this moment, not because we've gone back to put a bunch of information in there. We're just looking at a moment that is a slice of his life that tells you something very important.
Yeah, he doesn't sit down and tell Sully my parents my dad was blah 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 and my mom was blah 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 and they did blah 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 and then I was and they sent me to boarding school and that's where I learned all this Latin stuff and then I was I'm gonna get out screw you losers, I'm gonna find a cool ring, and so then I got here and I found this ring and I met you and that's what I am. And it's they don't do that. It's you get a little bit of I learned Latin in this boarding school, and it's I kind of run away, and that's basically the exposition you get around Nathan Drake, if you could even really call that part exposition. And it's you get so much sense of where he is in his life, what he's looking for, and who he is as a character, just by the things that he's doing and how he reacts to situations.
And if you compare it to the Last Crusade opening. The Last Crusade opening is using audience knowledge to make us laugh at the birth of Indiana Jones cliches.
Yeah, because a creepy dude gives him his hat.
Yeah, and it's clever in that way, and it's fine. But how does Uncharted 3 use our audience knowledge? It uses what we've kind of gathered from Nathan Drake in between the lines, which is that I think there's always that doubt. He's probably not Francis Drake's descendant.
Of course he's not.
That doesn't make sense, really.
Yeah.
And even though he says it with confidence, it sounds like it's bluster. And then you get it here, and again, they don't ever explicitly say that, and that's what makes it powerful, which is that he's looking for some kind of meaning in his life. And what's really moving about that sequence, the father figure he finds is Sully. And that sets the tone for the rest of that game.
Yeah, and that's another really key distinction is that, Indy doesn't have another character in his life that's that important. Although it would have been great if at the ending of Last Crusade, they set up the first time he meets the John Rhys Davies character. Because, he's, kind of the only really recurring character other than Marion, if you include Indiana Jones 4. But, with Uncharted, you have, those relationships you already know. So it is a lot more impactful to see, and it feels a lot more natural to see the first time these characters meet. That feels like a moment that's, natural to show the audience in a way that, showing the first time Indiana Jones gets his scar because Harrison Ford has that scar and gets that hat because Indiana Jones has that hat. That's not an impactful, powerful moment. It's a fun little sequence that's hey, this is a character we like, and this is an adventure he had when he was a kid, and River Phoenix was a really great actor. It's yeah, that's all good. But the Uncharted 3 stuff, one, it actually sets up the themes of the game in a much more significant way than the slight nod to Indiana Jones's dad at the end of that opening sequence. And here it's you get this game is all about Nate and Sully and their relationship. It's Elena is very important to that too, but it feels the conversation, whereas the conversation was really focused around Nate and Elena in Uncharted 2, and with Sully sort of being a little part of that, this game feels it's a lot more, this is Nate and Sully and their relationship and how that has to go, and Elena's a significant part of that, but it's she feels she is there to comment upon and move the relationship between Nate and Sully in certain ways.
I mean, if you consider the biggest standout set piece of this game, the boat stuff,
Yeah.
That's all predicated on Nate going to save Sully.
Yeah, and the mansion sequence is all him and Sully trying to get the fuck out of there.
Right.
Like, it's him and Sully, and it's whereas it was like Nate, Elena, and Chloe in Shangri-La at the end of Uncharted 2, it's fucking Nate and Sully going in kicking ass in like the lost city in the desert. It's like they're just like kicking down doors and popping some motherfuckers. Old school style. You know what I'm saying? God damn it. Victor Sullivan.
Victor Sullivan's the best.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I don't think any of the Uncharted games have like great villains. But where one, I don't remember a single thing about him.
It's a British dude and a guy who's voiced by Robin Atkin-Downs, and you fight the Robin Atkin-Downs guy at the end.
And then Robin Atkin-Downs plays a different character later in the series.
Yes, he plays the assistant in Uncharted 3.
Yes.
And it's funny how in Uncharted 1 his character is like this sort of maybe like Brazilian, like it's some sort of like South American character, and then Uncharted 3, it's a British dude. I feel like I've heard Robin Atkin-Downs so much that's like I like feel like I filter out the accent of his voice at some point, even though he's good at doing the accents. I'm not saying he's bad at it, but it's like I've been able to identify that character or that actor so well at this point that it's like I almost can't even tell that he's doing an accent anymore.
There's several prominent voice actors who do several parts across the Uncharted series, which I think is funny. But anyway, like it's amazing Troy Baker was never in the original trilogy. Frankly.
Yeah, it is kind of weird that never happened.
They were able to save him in their back pocket for Uncharted 4. But no,
and Lazarevich in Uncharted 2 is like...
No, and I was going to say, the only thing I remember about Uncharted 2 is the villain is that his name is Lazarevich because they say it so many times.
Yeah, and it's a cool name. I like it.
But then in Uncharted 3, I like that it's almost this consortium of villains, one of whom is this woman who has some mysterious connection to Sully and Nate. Again, I love that it's never really made explicit what that is. And the guy she's with, and it just feels...
Talbot, that's
Talbot,
his name.
Yeah, they just feel like a little more interesting. And I don't think the point is ever the villains in these games. They're not Batman movies or anything. And that's fine, but I think they found a really good balance in Uncharted 3 with it.
Yeah, I think it's a lot more... I mean, this is like both game design and like narrative thrust. Is that like fighting Uncharted or Lazarevich at the end of Uncharted 2 is kind of like just kind of has to happen, and the boss fight's not that good. There's like beating the fuck out of Talbot at the end of Uncharted 3. That's a satisfying boss fight.
Absolutely.
Because like because by that point Naughty Dog sort of understood how to have like a kind of boss fight sequence in an Uncharted game and not to do the Uncharted 2 thing, which really sucked. And so like putting like the fist fight stuff in it works really well. And then they also just built up Talbot as being this guy of like, you know, through the hallucinations, making him like this figure of interest for Nate. And you like sort of chasing him in Yemen and having the hallucination where he shoots Sully and all that stuff, like makes it so that when you get to the end of the game, you're like, I'm just going to beat the fuck out of you, dude. That's good. That's what you want from a boss fight, is to feel that like I'm going to kick this guy's ass.
Absolutely. Yeah, so I don't even know what more we can say about specific parts of Uncharted 3 other than just it feels like the culmination of these games, both narratively, thematically, from a game design standpoint, musically in some ways, graphically, you know, technology-wise.
The puzzles are...
we have to mention
improved.
some of the puzzles.
Yeah.
My favorite one is it's the one where Nate comments it looks like a Jeopardy board. But you have that board and you have to figure out the symbols, and you go around and you're using a lot of different things. You've got your notebook and you've got the symbols on the walls, and then you have to move that stuff. That one I think is just brilliant, but there's a lot of really good ones.
Yeah, I like the one where there's like all like the posing like soldier like statue parts, and you have to like find the right angle
I like
to
that
like
one.
line it all up. They like have, and there's something that they do like with Uncharted 2 as well, where there's like if there's like a puzzle type, there are two puzzle types you know from these like vague like Tomb Raider-esque kind of games. And when I say Tomb Raider-esque in that sense, I mean like more the old Tomb Raiders, is you know there are light puzzles where you have to shine lights through mirrors, and you know that there are gear puzzles where you have to put gears in certain spots to make a thing go. Uncharted 2 has a light puzzle, and Uncharted 3 has... mirror puzzle is more descriptive. And Uncharted 3 has a gear puzzle. But in both instances, they do a much better job of it. It doesn't feel like a generic thing. Whereas like Uncharted 2, it's this whole like thing where you're like climbing up like that like Statue of the Dagger, and you're like having to move the mirrors. But it's like... It's not about you having to like to find the pixel perfect angle to get the mirror to go to that mirror.
No.
It's like more this big adventure where it's like you're climbing up on all this stuff and shit's falling apart, and like that thing you're climbing on is like slowly decaying because it's like this 1,000-year-old artifact, and like the mirror thing is just like a little bit of staging for your progress of exploring this environment. And Uncharted 3 does basically the same thing with a lot of its puzzles, particularly that gear puzzle, where it's like it's like, yeah, like you have to find the right shaped gears with the symbol on it to put in the slot. Like that is what the puzzle is in the way that like shooting the mirrors in the right spot is what you do for the mirror puzzle in Uncharted 2. But what that puzzle like is about is you like exploring that room and like finding the thing that like lines up in the perfect way to see the symbol and finding where all the gears are hidden around the environment and like gathering them together. And it's like, and that's the thing about the Uncharted puzzles is that most of them, they know it's like, this isn't about like you sitting here for an hour and trying to like figure this out and like push everything in like every possible combination. It's like we give you the hints to solve it fairly quickly, and a lot of it is about you just like looking around the environment, finding what you need to find, and sort of assembling it together. And like it's about exploring that little section of the game, and not about like pushing a bunch of buttons all over the place. You know?
Yeah, and one other thing I forgot to mention with Uncharted 2 that continues in Uncharted 3, which really continues in The Last of Us, is that they start doing these, and I think it's one of the most brilliant breakthroughs that isn't talked about in the Uncharted games. Just these little things where, like, you have to get to a higher ledge, so you go over and press triangle so someone else comes and stands on your hands and goes up. Or or you have to raise a little gear so you can get under the door and then someone moves it. Just those little things that I don't think you would ever think about in game design otherwise, because they're just things that have to happen, and usually I think the characters would just do them.
Yeah.
But having this slight level of interactivity on totally mundane things makes the entire game feel way more involving for some weird reason. And then they really capitalize on that in The Last of Us, where that is a primary, if not the primary mechanic of those games.
Yeah, because what it is what they find to do is with all, like, particularly with Last of Us, like, that's the whole game, because it's Joel and Ellie, like, it's their journey together. And so there's much more of a focus there. But with Uncharted, like, there are huge stretches of that game where it's like, it's Nate and it's Elena. I almost said Ellie again. It's Nate and it's Elena, or it's Nate and Sully, or Nate and Chloe, or, like, some combination of them. And it's like you're like going through this section together, and it's like and there are tons of video games that have little bits like that where it's like, hey, like this character's with me, and they're kind of doing some stuff too. But usually it feels very inconsequential. Whereas here, like through having a bunch of dialogue and also finding a bunch of very small, innocuous ways through like gameplay interactions, just be like, I'm going to lift this door up, and like you get under, like going to slide under, then I'll hold it up while you come under. And it's like that takes like 5 seconds, and so it's not intrusive, and it's probably also hides a loading screen very well, which is probably what those sequences are really built for from a technical point of view. But they use it to make it feel like I am with Sully or I'm with Elena, and we are moving through this area together. And like, or like that mirror section with Chloe, it's like we are both solving this puzzle. Like, and like Chloe goes and like that's another brilliant thing. Chloe goes from basically half that puzzle, and she's the one who actually moves the mirror because you figured out what the puzzle is, and she's down there and she will move the puzzle for you, or she'll move the mirror for you and solve that part of the puzzle, and you'll solve the other half of it. And the characters are talking the whole time, and they stick that through the entire experience. Particularly with Uncharted 2 and Uncharted 3, they do really well at that. And that's something that like so many games just sort of will ignore. Like they'll just ignore that these other characters are there. Like in Halo 5 is a perfect example where it's like you are always moving with a team of 4 people for co-op reasons. But if you're playing it single player, they might as well not be there. Like it doesn't.
It would be better if they weren't there.
It's like you can give them an order to shoot a guy, and like they kind of fuck up all the respawn mechanics in the single player game because like all that stuff, them picking you up, that all sucks, and they just feel like idiots. And they have almost no dialogue. They have basically no character is built up between them. You never feel like you have to work with them at any sequence of the story because they have to be built for co-op, so they can never be important enough, like in that situation, because you have to account for another person playing them instead of them being a tool for the story. And all that stuff, it just feels like these characters might as well not be here, and it feels like a huge waste and a detraction from the game. Whereas Uncharted, all throughout the experience, if it's like that other character being there, like Sully being there with you for the mansion sequence, and he's not there for the boat sequence, that's part of what makes those sequences like defining and different. It's just like the experience with Sully and going through this crazy thing is like, that feels like fun and exciting, whereas like it's kind of a lot more harrowing when you get the boat sequence because you are alone and you have no one to equip with and no one to have fun with, you know?
Yeah.
It's like they just are masters at that stuff.
Absolutely. So I think that's a good note to end this part of the discussion on. To kind of cap some of this, I want to ask the question. I think we can both answer this.
Yeah.
If you had to pick best set piece in the Uncharted series, which one do you go with?
The boat section. That in Uncharted 3. That down in my mind.
Talk about it.
So there's a bunch of things with it. There's like one, like you have the, as I just said, you have the mansion burning down sequence, which sort of like is very similar in concept to the boat sequence in that both of those sections are built in such a way that you see, like, you know your overall goal, and you see the environment you're in, and you explore the environment in a normal capacity with you shooting a couple of guys and stuff, and then at some point, everything falls apart, and you have to get the fuck out immediately. And so both of those sequences have that same basic structure, but the boat sequence is basically the mansion sequence taken up to, like, the nth degree, where it's like, I mean, everything about it, from the placing in the story where, like, all of a sudden you are alone, like shit has gone real wrong. You don't know, like, where Sully is. You don't know where Elena is. You don't know where you are because you've been kidnapped by this fucking pirate. And you wake up, you have to, like, do one of those little melee fights where you knock out all the guys in the cabin. You come out, you see this other, like, this, like, ship wreckage that you're in, and it's like you see the goal, and you're like, okay, I'm going to find Sully. I'm going to save him. I'm going to get out of here. And you start moving through that environment. So the pacing of that is perfect. Like, the setup of it is perfect. And that whole level, because it's like the boat is like sinking while you're in it. That is like the exclamation point at the end of the sequence. But the whole sequence is built so perfectly of you exploring the ship wreckage. It has the best combat sequences in the game, in my opinion, because they are the most open, especially there's like a big open arena section where there's like a bunch of guys on all these little boats and you're like swimming between them.
It's amazing. It's
and
amazing.
And it's like where it really capitalizes on the stealth elements in the combat. It's like there's a bunch of different weapons to choose from, and it's like you clearing out those sections, like those are great. Then you see like the cruise liner, and you know, okay, now I need to get to the cruise liner. To get to the cruise liner, it's like you have to fight all these guys and get on this boat in the middle of like a fucking typhoon, and it's like you're shooting rocket launchers at guys on the typhoon. So things are like escalating. You get on the boat, and then things calm down a little bit once you get onto the cruise liner, and you move through the cruise liner. You have a couple of like fights, and like again, like I think a lot of the really well designed arena sections in Uncharted 3 that make the a lot of the combat feel a lot better in 3 because the environments are just better designed. And you get some of those, and that feels all good. And again, like, and the whole time you're just, need to save Sully. That's like the best goal you can possibly give me. Is like, I want to save Sully. Like, that would be heartbreaking if Sully died. And so I like get through. It's like you find out the twist is like Sully's not there. That pirate guy, and that pirate guy's an asshole. And like with Talbot, you want to beat him up because he's a piece of shit. And then as soon as you like that story reveal happens, you have to fight your way out. And as you fight your way out, the boat starts sinking, and the boat's sinking, and you like then it's just like it's like the hallway in Inception where it's like everything's flipped on its head. You're like climbing on like furniture in weird ways, and it leverages the platforming in a way that like uses the platforming aspects of the game to really get across. I'm in a sinking goddamn boat, and having that sequence in a video game, whereas in a movie you've seen that like 100 times of like characters in a sinking boat that have to get out really quickly. That's like what the entire movie Titanic is built around, basically. It's like that's what it wants. Like that's like the climactic sequence of Titanic is built around at the very least. And like, but having that in a gameplay sequence where it's like you're actually having to run away from the rushing water and climb up this boat because everything has gone topsy turvy. It's like that adds a whole like really exciting dimension to it that like doesn't really get across well in film. But then like I just like the topper is when you get to the part where you're in the big kind of ballroom. And there's the huge glass, what is like the ceiling, but it's on its side, and you see the boat sinking. It's basically underwater, and you see that, and they're climbing down like the chandelier. And it's like then there's just like the visuals, like the art design, as we said before in Uncharted, is incredible, and the visual of that sequence is amazing, and it just gets across so much how fucked all this is because you just see the scale of what this cruise liner you're in is, and you're about to leave, and it's like in the back of your mind you see that glass, you see it's kind of cracked, you know this is. Like, fuck, it's like, I just want to get out of this room. And right before you get out, that fucking asshole shoots the glass, and it all breaks, and the water's rushing at you, and you have to escape. Like, all of that, the pacing of that whole sequence, how it builds the environment, how it gives you a goal, and uses visual cues constantly, so you're always seeing on the horizon the next place you're trying to get to, like the next little bit of ship, the next cruise liner that's, like, always there, constantly reinforcing your objective. Like, the level design for it is just absolutely masterful. And then the scope of it is so huge and so awesome, and it's something that you've seen so many times before in movies and stuff. But it's done better here than it's ever been done in any movie that I've ever seen, and that's why that sinking ship section is by far my favorite part of that game. It's not my favorite like set piece of Uncharted 3. Like it's my favorite bit of game design in the entirety of the series so far.
It is definitely fantastic. I agree with all of that. I think from a game design standpoint, it is absolutely the best set piece. I don't know if I'd call it my favorite just because there was something visceral to me about that entire train sequence in Uncharted 2 that I found like I am playing the greatest adventure movie ever made.
Right, yeah.
And it gets a leg up by being kind of the first big one of those in the Uncharted games. I mean, I guess there's the building stuff, but that's not quite on the same level of what they're doing.
That's like a little teaser for like how they handle the stuff later.
Just the way where you're on a constantly moving train. They've designed enough environment to just be barreling through all this. You're going, on the side of the train, you're going on top, punching a dude, you fall back down, you go through a cart, you go back up, and then you're like the things that come over, like the stoplights or whatever, and you have to duck under those while someone else gets hit, and then you go through a tunnel.
Very good game design use of the Doppler effect of to like dodge those stoplights.
Absolutely. And of course, if you don't notice it the first time, you're just going to go flying, which is great. And all of that was just, literally just playing parts of that with my jaw open, like, what am I looking at? Yeah. How did they do this? So I find that great. And the other one, like, on a visceral level, the one that probably took me aback the most is the burning house,
it's really
the mansion, because, and especially in 60 frames per second, fire is one of the things. Fire and water are the two most striking things in 60 FPS. And just having that burning building in 60 FPS, going back through the area you've already been through, and it's all falling down, and like every time you think it's about to end, it gets fucked even more.
Yeah.
And I think from a character standpoint, what that sequence does is just incredible. But yeah, I think the one that I probably respect the most and think is the most significant from a design standpoint for everything you identified is the boat sequence. Also, the boat sequence leads to my favorite character interaction probably in the whole series, which is where you get back and you think you're going to have kind of a big, not confrontation, but maybe a big conversation with Elena.
Yeah.
And instead it's just Nathan says exactly what you know he's feeling, which is, I'm sorry. And he kind of passes out with her and she says, I know. And just kind of that they don't really even need to talk about it. But their lives have gone to a point where this is what it is at this moment. But you also kind of see Nate's future etched in that scene.
Yeah.
That he's going to move beyond this because he has to, because that was ridiculous.
Yeah, that's like, because that is the thing, because that's the thing with that sequence of Uncharted 3 is that I think, because it's almost like dumb to try to pick out one of those moments, because what they do is they build on all of them so well that they use them, the juxtaposition of them, because it is that like burning house sequence sets up how that boat sequence plays out, but on like the boat sequence it's just a much more massive scale. And so it is when like that's over and he goes back to Elena's apartment and he's half dead. He basically passes out on her couch saying, I'm sorry. It is you like that's where I feel like they use that escalation in like the game design to get across the feeling of Nate like can't take this anymore, and it's like all he has left in him is he needs to save Sully, and he needs to put this like event with like Kate and Talbot to an end. Both for like obviously like they can't let them take over the world, but that's like the sort of almost petty reason. It's like really it's like he needs to put that part of his past behind him because he's been chasing this his whole life, and it's like that's such a huge turning point for his character in the middle of that game. But it's like it's communicated with like the most subtle of dialogue.
Absolutely. The character shift that happens in Uncharted 3 is monumental, but also seismic in the true sense of the term, because it's like shifting tectonic plates.
Yeah.
You don't notice it until you get there, which is what's so fantastic. So those are the 3 Uncharted games. How much of Golden Abyss have you played?
Probably about an hour. I don't know.
I played about 45 minutes.
Yeah,
that's a really bad game.
It's probably fine, but it's like compared to the proper Uncharted games, like it's not that good. Like it's doesn't hold up.
This is the Vita one we're talking about. If you don't know, I got to a point where I realized, man, not even Nolan North sounds like he's having fun in this one. I can check out.
Yeah, it's not great.
I'm sure whoever worked on it put a lot of work into it. And
it was a Vita launch game, like as I talked about with Zamba. Like it's like launch games are very hard to make, and they tend not to age very well. Like go back and try to play fucking Perfect Dark Zero. I double dare you.
No, and it's the kind of thing where you just have to keep in mind, I think no one can really do this other than Naughty Dog. Like, I really hope Sony doesn't get too full of themselves and say, we're going to make Uncharted 5 without Naughty Dog. That would be such an act of hubris. It is. They are the developer as auteur and kind of the clearest version of that in the United States, I think. And just fantastic. So, great games. Love this trilogy to death. But there's going to be one more.
Yes.
Uncharted. What do you want to see out of Uncharted 4?
I like really want to see like where the story goes. Like in terms of the first time they announced Uncharted 4, I was a little bit like sort of like pessimistic about it in terms of, because by the time they announced it, I had already played through the first 3 Uncharted games, and I had felt like Uncharted 3 was like a really great ending for those characters, and I couldn't think of where to go. And so, but replaying them now that I obviously like know that Uncharted 4 is coming out because it's almost out, and like playing through Uncharted 3 again with that knowledge, and like being able to now like look at Uncharted 3 in that light of thinking like, okay, if this isn't the last game and this isn't the end to Nate's story, like what is the next step? And knowing the basics of how his brother plays a role in 4, I think there is like a really strong story to tell about. Uncharted 1, 2, and 3 are all like in different ways kind of about Nate trying to get out of that life of taking risks that he has found himself in, and sort of trying to like value his life in a bigger way and find a life with other people in a bigger way that he just like can't really accept. And like Uncharted 3 is him finding that moment, is what it really feels like, and like really accepting his relationship that he has with Elena, putting all this stuff with like his fascination with Francis Drake and all that stuff kind of behind him, and it's like putting on a new ring. It's like there's like they use that symbol for a good reason at the end of Uncharted 3, and that was why I thought you couldn't do anything else, because it felt like that's him getting out of the life. But there is a very interesting story to tell, is like now that he is out of that life, like what happens when he needs to go in for another reason, like when he has matured to that point. We like what is exploring that Nathan Drake, and obviously like for story reasons you need to have like all the crazy adventure stuff. I think having him have a brother and bringing his family in is a good excuse to get that to happen. But I feel like what I really want to see, and I think what Naughty Dog is choosing to explore with Uncharted 4, is what does Nathan Drake look like when he has matured to that point, and you need to have that dynamic with his. Which is an interesting dynamic, hopefully will be very interesting, with his older brother who hasn't moved on, but the younger brother has. And like having that like sort of dichotomy and that sort of like weird juxtaposition and that like kind of weird twist of fate between these two brothers, like that could be a really great story. And I think Naughty Dog has obviously, like what we talked about, all the chops in the world to tell it.
Absolutely.
So that's what I like. That's the main thing I really just am eager to see.
I'm eager to see all of that. I am eager to see what Naughty Dog can do with the PS4 hardware.
Absolutely.
Because I don't think we've ever seen a developer this talented in these ways step up to the plate.
Yeah, and we haven't seen a developer that's like so good at pulling out absolutely everything that a console can offer. Like the way that like Epic could with Gears of War in the Xbox 360 days, the way that Bungie could with the original Xbox and the Xbox 360, and obviously the way that Naughty Dog did with the PS3 with the Uncharted games and Last of Us. No developer has quite like squeeze that power out, because the exclusives have been so limited this generation so far, because that like game has just kind of like changed in terms of how video games are made and who makes them.
And a lot of the big at-bats this generation were cross-generational games. So Destiny is not what Bungie can do with this hardware. We're going to find out probably with Destiny 2, and that'll be very exciting. But this feels like one of the... Even though we're in year 3 of this generation, this feels like one of the first really major events of the generation.
Yeah, just because like game development times have gotten so much longer now that it's like it just takes that long to like get a developer that like, because again, like a Naughty Dog made The Last of Us Remastered. Like that was the first game they put out on PS4. They didn't. No other company handled that. Like that was Naughty Dog themselves to get a handle on the PS4 tech. So it's like this is our first time having like what feels like this really skilled, like a like exclusive console developer, like have a lot of time to make a game for that console. Because like Into a Second Son obviously was a great exclusive for the PS4. That came out like a couple of years after, or a couple of months after the console launched. So like was a young game in that console's lifetime compared to this. That feels like it's coming at the early midpoint.
Yeah, and I mean there's Halo 5 you can't forget about, but it's disappointing in some ways. Not on any technical level, obviously technical masterstroke, but. Yeah, I am also curious to see. A lot of change happened in Naughty Dog during the development of this game.
Yeah, Amy Hennig has left for, I think she's at Visceral now, working on a Star Wars game.
Yes, and I look forward to seeing what she does, but this is now Bruce Straley and Neil Druckmann, who headed The Last of Us. Obviously a very different game. I want to know what comes in from The Last of Us. And what cross-pollination there is, because of course there will be some. A lot of Uncharted is in The Last of Us. I would hope a lot of The Last of Us, not like the super dark shit or anything. I don't need like, Nathan Drake to have like one bullet left in his gun and Elena as a zombie coming at him. I don't want that. But, I want to see what kind of movement and platforming stuff comes into this. I know they're making interesting changes, like having dialogue options, which is crazy.
Yeah, I'm curious how prevalent that will be for the game.
Yeah, and I just, how much of an evolution is this? How much of a conclusion is this? This is a really kind of interesting thing because usually in the last couple generations, especially for Naughty Dog, the generation mark has marked the end of their franchise, and then they move on, and that happens for a lot of developers, or at least it changes hands or something, like with 343 versus Bungie and the Halo series. But now we've got them coming onto a new generation to finish an old series that inspired a new IP in The Last of Us. It's just a really interesting cross-section of a lot of big moments in game design, and I want to see what comes of it. Because if Uncharted 4 follows the trajectory of 1, making a leap to 2, making a big leap to 3, how good could this game be? It's crazy.
Yeah. And I'm also really curious to see how far they've come with designing the combat stuff and the combat sections, because as we talked about with Uncharted 3, I think there are combat sequences of that game where they show how much they've matured, where Uncharted 1 has very basic combat design in terms of the environment and stuff like that and the kinds of enemies they throw at you, whereas Uncharted 3 you get to that boat sequence and it's they have really open it up. They give you a lot of different avenues and allow you to be very creative. I'm just curious with Uncharted 4, how much did the stealth from Last of Us, how much does that come in? Because that's always been an element of the Uncharted combat. There's stealth sequences and stealth takedowns you can do, but it's always felt like a minor part. Just how does that evolve? How does the melee for Uncharted evolve? Because that was the main thing about the combat, really drastically improved between 1, it's clunky as shit and terrible. 2, it's it's okay, but just feels it's not sort of impactful. And 3, everything about the animation and the sound effects and how it's incorporated into the combat feels it's a really important part of how that combat works. So how does that evolve? How open is the grappling hook mechanic? Because that's a big part of the multiplayer beta I played, and we've seen it in some of the footage. But how freeform will you be with that? Because I hope there'll be lots of grapple points in the combat arenas and stuff. There's a huge amount of potential for this game to do a lot of things a lot better than the other Uncharted games did, as well as they did it. So I'm just everything about it. I'm super excited to see where they go.
Absolutely. We are, as of this recording, exactly a month out from the game. When you hear this, it'll be less than that. We're doing this a couple weeks before Uncharted 4, just because end of April and early May is going to be really busy with stuff like Captain America: Civil War. So wanted to get this out of the way a little earlier. But very few games I'm more excited for in the future than Uncharted 4. Yeah. A Thief's End. Love that title, too. It's just they're laying it all out. This is what we're doing. This is not Uncharted 4, the beginning of the second trilogy. This is Uncharted 4, and then we're done.
Yeah.
It's very interesting.
Yeah. Before we close this out, I want to pose a question to you, Jonathan, about Uncharted, because I feel we can't have this conversation talking about this series without talking about the thing that in game criticism I think is the Uncharted is sort of most famous for, and it's something I have a lot of thoughts about, and I assume you probably do too, is that Uncharted has gotten a lot of criticism, particularly from 2 and 3 on, or I guess from 2 on, about the way that the violence and the combat is mixed in with the much more sort of light adventure story tone, and people throw around the ludicrous narrative dissonance tone or term a lot without maybe always properly understanding what it means. But it's but how do you feel about that? Do you think that there is a big contradiction there? Do you think that it's a problem that Nate just goes around and he shoots a bunch of people, and if you want to be very aggressive about your terminology, you can say he murders hundreds of people over the course of the game, but still gets away with a wisecrack and a smile? Does that bother you in any way?
One.
Yeah.
This, as we said, it has primary influences in things like Indiana Jones. Also James Bond, which you can't ignore.
Yeah.
I think is part of the DNA. And those things have a long lineage in film going back to literally the beginning of film history, where that is just a thing in this genre, the adventure serial genre, which is that the body count just kind of goes up because you need something happening with the foes that are there, and the character just kind of kills people. You can't have an Indiana Jones who is Batman and refuses to kill.
Yeah.
That doesn't work. A character-defining moment for Indiana Jones is a guy wants to have a sword fight, Indy pulls out his gun and kills him in cold blood.
Yeah.
If you want to be aggressive with your terminology, one of the best things Indiana Jones ever does is a brutal murder of someone.
Yeah.
So
just guns him down in the street.
So this is not without context.
Yeah.
Second, it is not afraid to be a video game. And I'm okay with that, because you have to just embrace your video gaminess sometimes. And yes, is it a little ludicrous at points how many people Nathan Drake is mowing down? Of course it is. Absolutely. Does it strain credulity? Absolutely. But within the overall context of the universe these games have created, I think it is justified as something to keep the gameplay moving along. It is very arcadey. It has lineages in, as I said, the arcade, in movies. It gets heightened when you turn it into a video game thing. Would I necessarily disagree with someone who finds it problematic? No, because I think part of that is a taste thing and a tone thing, and I get that. But I would also say there is a very tight interplay between all these things. And while, yes, on some level you are asked to ignore that Nathan Drake is killing a lot of people, you're also asked to ignore the sheer ridiculousness of some of the supernatural stuff.
Yeah.
Of the underground cities that he just keeps finding.
About, like, the machinations of the underground cities, yes. Of these, like, complex gear organizations that, like, move entire, like, walls that have somehow survived the millennia.
Yeah. You have to understand your tone, the pulp genre this is pulling from, and I think with all of that in mind, it's okay. And I would also say it is not a coincidence that the Uncharted series leads very directly to the game that closed the gap on ludonarrative dissonance more than any other game ever, being The Last of Us. That did not come from a vacuum.
Yeah, exactly.
So those are my thoughts on that issue.
Yeah, for me, it's something that, like, as I've, like, gotten a lot more invested into game criticism, and as also, like, the game criticism, like, market, as it were, has expanded a lot in the past couple of years. It's something that's frustrated me. That I feel like it's born from a place that's like feels like we've all done this of like joking around with our games of like Pokemon is my favorite punching bag just because it's so much fun to look at Pokemon and like think about the reality of Pokemon of like this world that exists where these wondrous creatures populate everywhere and it's like they have these incredible abilities and they seem to be basically intelligent, like they don't have language but they have like say their names all the time. That's kind of annoying, but whatever. And we have these 10-year-old children that leave home, that wander out into the world and capture these creatures in magical devices that shrink them down and force them to fight each other for blood sport to gain like fame, renown, and money. And it's like, and whenever like two trainers lock eyes, they are like blood deaded to fight and like fight for cash. Like there's nobody ever like walks away from the Pokemon battle without a little extra money in their pocket. You know what I'm saying? Like that's really funny to break apart and to like put in those terms. But at the same time, while it's funny, I think a part of game criticism has grown out of taking those conversations and taking them too literally of like losing track of like what the experience of the player actually is in playing these games. And that, like, again, it's really funny to do that, to think about those games in those terms, but, like, when you're playing Pokemon, you don't care, because that's not what the tone of the game is, it's not what the story of the game is, it's not what the world is really about. And when you're playing those games, like, you naturally just accept like this funny, weird, whimsical world that they live in where like all Pokemon are friends, nobody dies, even if there are ghost Pokemon, and even if the backstory of Marowak and like Cubone like is ghastly and grisly when you get into it. Ghastly, there we go, that's another pun for you.
What are you doing tonight, Sean?
I don't know, it's just happening, it's just coming out. I don't know, I need it, it fuels me. But like even when like that's as grim as it is, like the death does not exist. Fainting exists in Pokemon. And in a lot of ways in Uncharted, I feel like death kind of doesn't exist for the most part either. That's like killing an enemy in like an NPC in Uncharted is like, you can call it death. You can say that it's like he's murdering these people, he's killing these people. You can take it very literally. But I think like when you're doing that, you're just ignoring everything else that the game is telling you. You're ignoring everything about the tone of the story. You're ignoring everything about how they're situating these things, and you're ignoring everything about the reality of what game mechanics are in terms of if it's a game that has combat in it, enemies have to die or enemies have to be defeated in some way, and you don't need to turn Uncharted into like the Dragon Ball Z Game Boy game I used to play, where in the translation, every time a character died, they were defeated. So like when in the story mode, when Frieza killed Krillin, Gohan yells out, "Oh no, Krillin got defeated." And it's like, you can't do that. Like, and you have to just accept, I think, if we're going to try to take games critically, that like a game like this, as with a book that would have this kind of tone, or a movie that would have this kind of tone, is playful. And it's like, it's meant to be taken in a lighthearted way. And like, in the same way that like Indiana Jones kills people, but you don't really care. Like, it's not like, it doesn't impact death because it's not discussing death. It's not thematizing death. It's not interested in death. You have to ignore those kinds of things the way that if you're watching a fucking musical, you have to ignore the fact that people are singing all the time. Because guess what? Those people aren't literally singing in musicals. Like, Hamlet is not literally, like, just standing in the middle of the room talking to himself for 15 minutes in, like, the world that we live in. They exist in a world that exists within that medium that is unto itself. It's like, when you take it that seriously, you're just choosing to ignore what that medium is trying to offer you. And it's like, these things don't exist in the real world. They're not even really replications of the real world. They are pieces of art that we create that can have different tones, that can say different things. And when you try to take them all deathly seriously and treat Uncharted the exact way you treat The Last of Us, like, you're just losing sight of what I feel the mission statement of criticism is.
And I think The Last of Us and Uncharted, coming from the same developer, one, is in so many ways not a coincidence.
Yeah.
And two, is such a key point in this discussion, which is that tone and context matter.
Yeah.
You can look at Uncharted. It's not like Naughty Dog is unaware of what they're doing with death in Uncharted.
Yeah.
And it's not like they're unaware of what they do with it in The Last of Us, because that's what The Last of Us is literally about. But I don't think that means that in one they were ignorant and in one they were enlightened.
Yeah.
It's, this whole discussion, it's hilarious when you think about the double standard of it, that, like, Halo never gets brought up in it.
Yeah.
Master Chief kills an awful lot of grunts. And if you want to take this to the nth degree, you should say, you know what? All of those grunts had an interior emotional life.
Yeah, they had
are
families.
Sentient creatures.
They had food nipples to go home to suckle upon.
Absolutely. So why are we giving the Master Chief a free pass because they're non-humanoid? It is something that you, as you say, you have to understand context and the medium and what representation is and all these different things. And yeah, I haven't maybe heard this criticism as much aimed at Uncharted. I've heard it as a joke more than I've heard it as serious. But I know
there are. I've read plenty of think pieces that take that tack with the game, and it is something where it's like, you would never ever read a piece of, like, criticism on a piece of Shakespeare that talks about how, like, innocuous it is, or, like, how much it breaks the sense of realism when a character goes into a monologue and, like, Iago is talking to the audience and is, like, breaking the fourth wall, and, like, every other character on the stage could hear him. This is patently absurd. Like, and that feels like the kind of criticism that think piece is trying to get at, is just, like, trying to sound smart by, like, pointing out some sort of inconsistency or inaccuracy in terms of the piece of art replicating reality.
The biggest problem with criticism today in books, theater, movies, games, everything, is this commitment to realism, whatever the fuck that means.
Yeah.
I argue there is no such thing in anything, because the moment you take in a film, two pieces of film, and splice them together to do a time cut, realism does not exist in the sense that we experience it. It's the same in a fucking video game. It's the same in all of these, and you have to throw that out the window and take it where it's at. If I think emotional realism matters more.
Yeah.
So if, Nate did something crazy like walked into a room and slapped Elena, then criticize that, because that's out of character. It's sexist. There's all these other things going on, and that's the level of realism that actually matters.
Yeah.
Him going through and killing a bunch of people
in, like, a combat section.
in a combat section in a video game where this is a thing. Yeah, that's not the problem.
Yeah, yeah, and it's like, in saying all this is like, it's not saying that, like, I'm really anticipating seeing video games sort of find other ways to be interactive without necessarily having to have combat all the time. And obviously we're seeing that happen more and more these days, with, like, Gone Home a couple of years ago being a very stark example. It's like, I do want to see that. Like, it is sort of unfortunate that the medium's potential is not necessarily being fully mined. But at the same time, just because a lot of people, and like myself included, want to see the games, like, explore non-violent boundaries in terms of being interactive and still being interesting and entertaining in some way.
Yeah.
That does not mean that then you have to take Uncharted to task for being a third-person cover shooter and having combat sections that are necessitated by being a third-person cover shooter. In the way that, like, song sequences are necessitated by being a musical. If you don't like musicals, like myself, like, that's fine. If you don't like third-person cover shooters, then you don't have to play them. It's like, it is not something that, like, you need to criticize a genre or an example of a genre for being that genre. It's like, it's a funny thing to do, like I do with musicals, but I'm not offering that as, like, a legitimate piece of criticism. That's me just being.
You're not,
like,
saying musicals shouldn't exist.
I'm not saying musicals shouldn't exist. Even if I do, and I have probably said, and I will say many times, musicals shouldn't exist. I'm doing that because I think it's a funny thing to say. I'm never going to write an article that says that, because that's a stupid thing to try to say seriously. But seriously, musicals are fucking stupid, and they really shouldn't exist. I hate them.